Morning of Friday, October 29th, 1948, a young woman named Helen Stack woke up inside her modest home in the small town of Donora, Pennsylvania. And as soon as Helen opened her eyes, she started coughing. Her throat had been sore for a few days, but this morning it felt even worse. She thought she might be coming down with a cold, but Helen was not the kind of person to let a minor illness slow her down. So she still got out of bed, got dressed, and then drank some coffee and ate breakfast before starting her walk to work. From where her house stood near the top of a hill, Helen could sometimes see the entire town. Donora sat inside of a valley right on the banks of the Monongahela River, surrounded on three sides by 400-foot-tall cliffs. On the fourth side were rolling hills that stretched off into the distance. That morning, though, Helen couldn't see any of Donora's natural beauty, because fog was blocking her view. In fact, low gray clouds had been hanging over the town for the past 4 days. But that was actually normal, because Donora was inside of basically a natural bowl in the earth. The surrounding cliffs and hills blocked the wind, so the fog would accumulate and then get stuck in the valley. To Helen, this was just part of life in Donora. And while it was sort of frustrating at times, it was easy to ignore, because there were so many other good things about living there. Everybody was friendly, there were plenty of jobs, and there were always fun events going on. As she walked to work, Helen could hardly see across the street, but she could see enough in front of her to say hello to the neighbors who passed her by on her side of the sidewalk, who all knew her by name. And then at some point she passed by a street next to a bunch of industrial mills that were also shrouded in fog, and she knew that somewhere in that fog, most of the men in Donora were working. And when she reached McKean Avenue, the main street in town, she could barely make out the workers who were hanging up decorations for that evening's annual Halloween parade. Eventually, Helen came to a stop in front of a tall brownstone building on McKean Avenue. She went inside, walked up to the second floor, and unlocked the door of the doctor's office where she worked. Helen was the only employee working for the two doctors, Ralph Kohler and Edward Roth. To Helen, these two men seemed pretty similar. Both were in their 40s, they were tall and heavy-set, and they both had very kind and patient demeanors. The only obvious difference between them was that Dr. Roth smoked cigars like a chimney, and Dr. Kohler avoided cigars altogether because he had diabetes and a heart condition. As for Helen, she was a receptionist, a secretary, and a nurse, so she had a lot of responsibilities at the office. And today, like most days, she was the first one to the office. She turned on the lights and opened up the blinds in the waiting room, then began sweeping up the thin layer of soot that had blown in through the air vents and settled on the floor overnight. Like the fog in Donora, the soot was also very annoying, but totally normal to Helen. She knew it came from the mills nearby. It was just a normal part of living in a factory town inside of a valley. After Helen was all done cleaning up the waiting room, she looked around and smiled, because she had just enough time to go smoke a cigarette before the doctors came in and patients began to arrive. Helen sat down behind the reception desk and lit her cigarette. She took a long drag, but immediately she noticed it had a strange bittersweet taste to it. She tried again, and suddenly the tobacco tasted so awful that she doubled over coughing. She coughed until she had tears in her eyes, but she wasn't sure if it was from the cigarette, her sore throat, or maybe both. Either way, Helen stubbed out the half-smoked cigarette into her ashtray, and then she heard the door open. She looked up to see Dr. Kohler walking inside, and so she knew her workday was about to begin. A few hours later, at 3 p.m., Dr. Kohler stood in the back of the doctor's office and pulled on his overcoat. Even though it was only mid-afternoon, he already felt exhausted. His diabetes and his heart condition left him chronically tired, and to deal with it, he kept to a very specific schedule. He went home every day at precisely 3 p.m. so he could lay down and rest before dinner. But right when he was about to leave, he heard quick footsteps coming down the hallway, and Helen rounded the corner. She looked concerned and said an older man had just come in, wheezing and complaining that he couldn't catch his breath. Dr. Kohler knew he needed to get home for his own sake, but his partner, Dr. Roth, had already gone on a break, and he couldn't just turn away a patient who needed help. So he took off his overcoat and told Helen to bring the patient back to an exam room. Moments later, Dr. Kohler met that patient in the exam room, and he recognized him as one of his regulars. The man was one of many locals in town who Dr. Kohler treated for asthma, which is a chronic condition that causes a person's airways to swell and make it difficult to breathe. And so as a result, Dr. Kohler wasn't surprised that this patient was wheezing. Whenever the fog in Donora got really thick, people's asthma tended to flare up. So Dr. Kohler gave his patient the usual asthma treatment for 1948, which was a shot of adrenaline. Adrenaline is a hormone that can help open a person's airway when they're having trouble breathing. Once the adrenaline shot took effect and the man caught his breath again, Dr. Kohler sent him on his way. Then the doctor put his overcoat back on and followed that patient out, anxious to go home and get in bed. "30 minutes later, Helen sat at the reception desk and flicked through the day's mail. Usually, the office got quiet in the afternoons, and then business would pick up again in the evenings. So she was using the lull to get some administrative work done. Helen pulled out the junk mail from the pile and then got up to throw it away. But as she was walking towards the trash can, she heard a loud crash from the hallway outside the office, followed by the sound of somebody yelling. Helen's first thought was somebody fell down the stairs, and so she rushed to check if they were okay, and what she saw in the hallway absolutely terrified her. A man she didn't recognize was clinging to the banister, and his knuckles were white and his face was turning blue. He was moaning in pain, kicking the wall and screaming, help me, I'm dying." Helen was so confused and afraid that she just froze. Luckily, another doctor who ran his own private practice across the hall from them soon showed up, and so did the other doctor that Helen worked for, Dr. Roth. While those two doctors began to help the man, Helen heard the sound of her phone ringing at her reception desk. And so Helen kind of broke out of her trance, ran back inside the office and answered the phone, and immediately she heard the sound of a woman screaming on the other end of the line for help, just like the blue-faced man in the hall had been doing. The woman said her husband couldn't need his help. The phone rang again, and then again, and then again. And everyone Helen spoke to said the same thing. They couldn't breathe, they were coughing up blood, their heads hurt, their stomachs were killing them, and they all thought they were going to die. And unfortunately, the town only had a single ambulance, and it was booked solid. And so one after another, Helen took down these people's names and addresses and added them to the growing list of patients the doctors needed to visit. Helen had no idea what was going on in Donora, but it certainly felt like all hell had broken loose inside of her normally quiet town. Two hours later, at 6 p.m., Dr. Roth squinted as he very slowly drove down McKean Avenue after an afternoon of house calls. Because of the fog, which now had gotten so bad, he could hardly make out the lines on the road, and so he just gripped the steering wheel tightly and went really slow, keeping an eye out for the brownstone building where he worked. Dr. Roth had never been in a situation like this before. People all over town were struggling to breathe, regardless of whether they had asthma or not. And Dr. Roth really didn't know why. He figured it must be something in the air, literally, but even with fog this bad, he'd never seen it affect people this much before. By this point in the day, he'd already given so many patients adrenaline injections that he'd run through his entire supply, and he'd barely made a dent in the list of people who still needed help. And so now he needed to stop by the office and refill his supply of adrenaline before making more house calls. But it was literally too foggy to even find his own address. And so Dr. Roth figured he'd have better luck if he just parked his car and walked. So he carefully pulled to the curb, turned off the engine, and got out. He went to the sidewalk, and when he saw the nearest building to him, he realized he'd actually driven past his office without knowing it. And so Dr. Roth doubled back towards the brownstone, threw open the door, and began running up the stairs. However, after only a few steps, he had to stop because he ran out of breath, and then he began to cough. His chest felt tight, like somebody was squeezing the air out of him. He managed to make it back to his office, but immediately when he got there, he doubled over in the entryway and coughed until tears were streaming down his face. Dr. Roth felt like he was choking. He started to panic and looked around for help, but his secretary, Helen, had left for dinner, and his colleague, Dr. Kohler, who had left to go take a nap, was still at home. Dr. Roth realized he was all alone in his office. He held onto a desk and tried to steady himself, but he kept hacking until he felt nauseous. He managed to make it to the bathroom before he actually vomited. And then after that, he stumbled to the bathroom sink and splashed cold water on his face. His heart was racing and his whole body felt weak, but he knew he couldn't just stand there because he still felt faint. So he rushed towards the back room where drugs were stored and grabbed a vial of adrenaline and a clean syringe. With his hand shaking, Dr. Roth filled the syringe, poked the needle through his pant leg into his thigh, and injected himself with adrenaline. And after that, he just collapsed into his office chair. After a few moments, Dr. Roth took a big, deep breath. He sat there for several minutes, relishing how good it felt to breathe again. And as he slowly calmed back down, Dr. Roth tried to figure out what had just happened to him. Just like the patients he'd been visiting all day, he'd had what seemed like a sudden, very severe asthma attack. But why? He felt sure that something in the air, in the fog, was causing people all over town, including him, to nearly suffocate. But what? Fog was normal in Denora, so what was different about it this time? As he was thinking it over, Dr. Roth opened up a drawer in his desk, and out of pure habit, he grabbed a cigar. Without thinking, he struck a match, lit the cigar, and took a puff. And immediately, he launched into another uncontrollable coughing fit. Meanwhile, Helen was on her way back to work after her dinner break. She walked through the fog and past a crowd of people gathered on McKean Avenue. There were adults and kids, all dressed up in festive costumes. Helen knew they were all waiting for the annual Halloween parade to begin, but she couldn't think about candy and costumes right now. She was too preoccupied with getting back to work and making sure her patients were okay. She soon made it to the brownstone and went upstairs to the doctor's office, and right when she opened the door, she heard the phone ring. But before she could answer it, she heard something else. There was a groaning sound coming from the back hallway. It made the hair on the back of Helen's neck stand up, because Dr. Kohler and Dr. Roth were supposed to be at home on their dinner breaks. Helen should have been alone at the office. She followed the groaning sound back to Dr. Roth's private office, and she opened the door to find one of her bosses slumped in his chair. His face was bright red and drenched in sweat, he was wheezing, and his eyes were huge and terrified. But somehow, Dr. Roth spoke, and he told Helen he was okay. He just needed to catch his breath. Helen did not believe him, but she could still hear the phone ringing, and Dr. Roth told her to just go answer it. And so perhaps against her better judgment, she turned and left, and when she got back into the waiting room to answer the phone, she now saw there were a few patients that had come inside. She gestured to let them know she'd be with them in a second, and then she answered the phone. But this time, Helen didn't hear a patient begging for help. She heard her other boss, Dr. Kohler, and his voice sounded strained. He said that ever since he had left the office earlier that afternoon, he'd been struggling to breathe too, and he said he didn't know when he'd be able to come back to work. Helen said okay, but it really was not okay, because as she stood there holding the phone to her ear, the office door swung open and more coughing, wheezing patients tumbled inside. Helen felt so confused and helpless. Half the town was outside enjoying the Halloween parade, totally oblivious to what was happening. Meanwhile, the phone wouldn't stop ringing and patients were flooding into the doctor's office one after another. And the doctors, Dr. Kohler and Dr. Roth, were both deathly ill, and no one actually knew what was causing any of this. Helen felt like she had no choice but to close the office, because there was nothing Dr. Kohler or Dr. Roth could do for anybody. So she hung up the phone and turned around and told the patients gathered in the waiting room that she was very sorry, but they would have to leave and go to a different doctor's office for help. About 7 hours later, a man named Rudolf Schwerha was lying in bed with his wife. They were both developed severe respiratory symptoms and stopped breathing. Rudolf did not ask any follow-up questions because it was 2 a.m. and he wasn't really thinking straight, and also because he was totally unaware of the mysterious illness currently plaguing Denora. He just asked the woman for the address, and then said he would send his hearse to pick up the man's remains. Rudolf then called his hearse driver and explained the situation, and the driver said he was on it and would bring the remains back to the funeral home soon. Rudolf hung up, and while his wife went back to sleep, he laid there awake in bed and listened for the sound of the hearse pulling into his driveway. He figured the driver would show up within minutes, because the address was only 2 blocks away. But half an hour passed by before Rudolph finally heard a car's engine rumbling outside. Rudolph was about to get up to go greet the driver, but as soon as he threw back the covers, his phone rang again. And again, it's the middle of the night, and so these calls are not good news. Rudolph noticed his wife had just woken up, and she sat up next to him, looking confused. Rudolph picked up the phone and said hello, and he was surprised to hear that another person had passed away. And like the first, they'd suddenly developed severe breathing problems and then just died. 2 deaths within an hour of each other was unusual in a town as small as Donora, and it was even more strange for 2 people to just suddenly stop breathing. Rudolph didn't know what was going on, but now he felt uneasy, and he decided he should go with his driver to the next address. So Rudolph told his wife he'd be back soon, then he got dressed and hurried outside. A few minutes later, Rudolph rode in the passenger seat while his hearse driver inched down the street. It had taken the driver so long to get to the funeral home because the fog outside had somehow gotten even worse. It was like a solid gray wall. As the driver slowly inched forward, Rudolph stared intently out the windshield, desperately trying to somehow see through the fog. They were headed to a neighborhood on the opposite side of the Monongahela River, and to get there, they would have to drive across a very thin road right next to a cliff. And so Rudolph, naturally, was very concerned that they might accidentally drive right off of it. So when they neared the cliff, Rudolph told the driver to stop and said he wanted to drive, but he would still need the driver's help. While Rudolph got behind the wheel of the hearse, the driver got outside and stood in front of the car. Then he used a flashlight to guide Rudolph through the fog and make sure the car didn't slip off the side of the cliff. And so Rudolph gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles and did his best to drive as carefully as he could. He knew they would only need to cover a very short distance, but every inch on that cliff felt like torture. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they made it past the cliff and into the neighborhood. They picked up the deceased person's body and then turned right back around and did the same process of slowly driving past the cliff, and then finally, once they were on the other side, they headed back to the funeral home. And by the time they finally got back there, it was almost sunrise, and Rudolph's wife at this point was wide awake, standing by the front door. And the totally overwhelmed look on her face made Rudolph's stomach drop. He didn't need to ask her what was wrong. He could tell by the bags under her eyes that she must have been up all night answering phone calls intended for him, meaning more people must have died. So, as soon as Rudolph and the driver had moved the second body into the funeral home, they got back in the car to go pick up another, and then another, and another. By 10 a.m., there were 9 bodies waiting in the morgue, and the phone kept on ringing. Four hours later, at 2 p.m. on that Saturday afternoon, a man named August Chambon pulled into the driveway of his stately home in Donora. August was the town mayor, but he'd recently been away on business. So when he walked inside, he immediately went to the pile of messages his family had written down for him while he was gone. And as he worked his way down the stack of paper, his face went pale. Like many people in Donora, August had had no idea that a mystery illness was suffocating people to death all over town, until he saw all these panicked messages from residents, doctors, and morticians begging him for help. August realized he had a very serious emergency on his hands. Donora didn't have a single hospital, and several of the town's doctors were too sick themselves to work, so people who fell ill literally didn't have anywhere to turn. Meanwhile, bodies were piling up. Between Rudolph's funeral home and the others in town, the death toll was now at 11 people, and based on the calls he'd received, August estimated that hundreds, maybe even thousands more people were sick. August spent the rest of the day doing whatever he could to help. He worked with local nurses to create emergency medical stations. He called in doctors from out of town to come help. He had extra oxygen and inhalers shipped into Donora. He even called the state health department for backup. But at the same time, August didn't make any emergency announcements. But in fairness, he didn't really have a way to. Donora didn't have a local TV or radio news station, and the newspaper was only published on weekdays. And since this disaster had happened on a weekend, The only way for news to travel was by word of mouth. So, while half the town did their best to deal with this mysterious outbreak, the other half was blissfully unaware, carrying on business as usual. The local high school even went ahead with their scheduled football game, even though their players literally couldn't see more than a few feet across the field. But finally, after what felt like one of the longest days of his life, August felt like he needed to call a town meeting. Everybody needed to know what was going on. However, he couldn't get everybody from the city council and the Board of Health together until the following morning. And so first thing the next morning, which was Sunday, October 31st, August made his way through the thick gray fog to a government building downtown. There, he met with a bunch of community leaders to discuss what was going on. And they all agreed that the fog must have something to do with it. But there were a lot of questions that nobody could answer, like what made this fog different? And why was it making some people sick and even killing some people, while others seemed totally unaffected by it? They couldn't make sense of it, let alone figure out how to stop it. Then, at some point during their conversation, August began to hear rain pattering down on the roof. He looked out the window and saw the drizzle turn into a full-on downpour, and he watched in amazement as the rain seemed to wash the fog away. The thick gray clouds that had hung over Donora for nearly a week disappeared in minutes. And with it, the mysterious illness disappeared too. Just like that, the phones at Donora's doctor's offices stopped ringing. It would take years for public health researchers to understand what had happened during that October week in Donora, Pennsylvania. And that's because there was essentially a large-scale misinformation campaign to hide the truth. However, eventually, the truth came out. The so-called fog that blanketed Donora that week was not actually normal Donora fog. It was smog from Donora's many industrial mills. These mills manufactured steel, zinc, and sulfuric acid, and as part of that process, they pumped dangerous chemical byproducts directly into the air. Normally, the smog would float up towards the sky and dissipate quickly. But during October 1948, Donora was hit by a very rare weather event called a temperature inversion, which in short kept these dangerous chemicals down at street level for days. It worked like this. Usually, air is warmest near the surface of the Earth and gets colder as it goes upward towards the sky. But during a temperature inversion, this gets flipped around. Warm air moves into the space above cold air and traps the heavier cold air underneath it. And when this happened in Donora, which was situated inside a natural bowl in the Earth, the warm air was almost like putting a lid on top of that bowl. And so the deadly chemical byproducts from the mills were trapped, turning the air in Donora into a concentrated poison. But because fog was so normal in the valley, most people didn't think anything of it. Plus, throughout that very consequential week, and for years afterwards, the owners of the mills insisted they were not to blame, putting out a blizzard of misleading information to defend themselves. They claimed the weather was the problem, not the chemical byproducts. And many locals believed this, because they didn't want the mills to shut down. 2/3 of the men in Donora worked there, and the majority of families in town depended on that income. All told, at least 70 people died as a result of what became known as the Donora smog, and over 4,000 people were sickened. Experts said that X-rays of survivors' lungs looked like victims of chemical warfare. The Donora smog incident was the worst air pollution disaster in United States history. But it also sparked a national conversation about air pollution and the need for better industrial safety regulations. 2 years later, in 1950, the US held its first ever National Air Pollution Conference. After that, progress was slow but steady. The nation's first major air pollution law was passed in 1963, and the Environmental Protection Agency was formed in 1970. As of today, all of Donora's industrial mills have been shut down. There's now a museum in that town that commemorates those who lost their lives during Donora smog, and proudly displays the slogan, "Clean air started here."
What's going on, guys? MrBallen here, former Navy SEAL turned internet storyteller with a focus on the strange, dark, and mysterious. And speaking of mysterious, today I have a mystery for you, and it's one of the more recent mysteries. It happened in 2014 and spanned a couple of years following that. It is a story that plays out like a psychological thriller, and in fact, Netflix recently purchased the rights to make a movie or show about this case from the family that were the victims of this case. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have this all-American family that purchases their dream home. They're getting ready to move in, and they start receiving these awful, wrathful, threatening letters from some anonymous person or group. The letters get progressively worse and indicate that whoever is watching them very closely at all hours and is able to see things that are not easy to spot just from walking by. This is someone who is really intensely focused on the family. I think that the best way to watch this video and learn about this case, to really appreciate what this family went through, is to put yourself in the position of being the Broaddus family. That's the family that purchases the house. Imagine you're in their position. Would you have stayed or would you have left? And I'd love to hear about it in the comments section. So let's dive in. In June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus purchased their dream home. It is a $1.3 million 6-bedroom house in Westfield, New Jersey, which is a very affluent northern New Jersey town. So the house they purchased was on Boulevard, that's the street name, and Boulevard within Westfield is, at the time, was like the street. If you lived on Boulevard, you had made it. I would say that times have changed because now Boulevard is remembered as the place where this case happened, so I would say it's probably not the best place to live anymore, but at the time, it was like Derek and Maria were living their dreams and they knew it. 3 days after the sale of the house, they hadn't moved in yet. Derek had gone to the house to do some painting of the walls and some simple house renovations. I think he was just so excited about this house. He just wanted to go over and just kind of be in the space. So his wife and his kids are back at their old house that they had sold but hadn't moved out of yet. And so he's at the new house and he's doing these simple renovations and he's like, you know what, I'm gonna check the mail. Because even though they'd only owned the house for 3 days, he was like, you know what the heck, see what it feels like to go collect the mail, because this is gonna be my new home. And so he goes out and he opens the mailbox, and inside is this little tiny card-shaped envelope addressed to the new owners.
Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I'll find out.
The letter goes on to identify what kind of car they were driving. It was a Honda minivan. It went on to say he runs back into the house, shuts all the windows, locks all the doors, leaves the house and goes right back to his wife and his kids that are at their old home. And they promptly call the police. Police show up, they read the letter, and they're like, what is this? Do you have enemies? Who wrote you this? Because even the language inside the letter was like, it was not quite Old English, but close. It was like this bizarre writing, and it was just very stalkerish and awful, and the police just don't really know what to make of it. And Derek and Maria are obviously very upset. They haven't even moved into the house yet, but this is a big cause for concern. So the letter did not have a return address, but at the end of the letter, it just said,
who am I? I could be someone that's walking by your house every day. I could be someone driving by your house every day. I could be one of your neighbors. I could be anybody that you see at any given day, and you'll never know.
And then it just says, signed, The Watcher. After the police leave that night and promise to launch their own investigation, Derek and Maria, they're totally on edge. And so they write an email, even though it's super late, to the Woods family. They're the family that sold the house to Derek and Maria. And they say, hey, we just got the strange threatening letter. have you received anything like this? Because the watcher claims to have been watching you for the entire time you were there. And the Woods family writes back and they say, 3 days, I think it was 3 days before we actually left the house, we did receive a letter. It wasn't threatening. It was just thanking us for our time in the house and treating it with respect, and that it would be taken care of going forward, and that this person would look after the house for us, and it was signed the Watcher. But to be honest, we didn't think much of it. We crumpled it up and threw it away. So the Broadduses decide that they are not going to rush to actually move into the new house. They had thought about doing it, but they decide with this letter that maybe it's best to hold off a little bit. And so Derek and Maria would do day trips with the kids. They'd go do day trips, do some renovations, make sure that the contractors that were there were doing a good job getting the house in order, and then they would come back to the house that they were still living in. About 2 weeks after that letter was found, Maria is there with the kids, and she gets to the new house and she sees there's a letter from the Watcher, the same envelope, same writing on the outside, and so she immediately calls the police even before she reads it. She opens it up and it says,
"Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what's in the walls yet? In time, they will."
The Watcher goes on to identify each of their kids by nickname and by birth order, which implies that whoever this was close enough to Maria or to Derek when they were speaking directly to their kids using their nicknames that they overheard. Because it's one thing to know the children's full names, because it's possible that you could have looked it up online or something, but to know their nicknames, that implies a level of proximity that even though they knew the Watcher was probably in the neighborhood, almost definitely, this meant they were practically on top of one another. And it gets creepier. The Watcher also in this letter asks, about one of the children and says, "Is she going to be an artist? I saw her using her easel yesterday." Well, the easel that this girl had been using is in a back room of the house that is mostly obscured by trees and shrubbery. There's really only one vantage point where you could see this child, and it would mean you're right on the property, like pretty much in plain view of anybody there. And with Maria and Derek and basically everyone on high alert looking for this person, it seems odd that they could be able to see this girl working at her easel in this kind of hidden back room and not be spotted. And then, of course, to kind of seal the deal, making this letter just totally terrifying, they go on to say,
"Do your kids go in the basement? I'd be afraid if I were them. It's far away from the rest of the house, and if you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. Then I can plan better."
So at this point, Derek and Maria are in full crisis mode, because it's one thing to be watched, which is bad. It's another when the person watching you is now overtly threatening your family, your kids. It's a bad situation. So Derek and Maria at this point, they don't know if they're even ever going to move into this new house. It felt unsafe. And so for a few weeks, they're kind of teetering on whether it's worth moving in or not, and so that they aren't there. They're not going to the new house at all. And a third letter arrives basically saying, "Where are you? The house misses you," obviously from the Watcher. At one point between the first letter and third letter, Derek was speaking with John Schmidt, who lived 2 doors down from their new property on Boulevard. And John was saying that Derek ought to look into the Langfords. It was a family that lived right next to their new house, kind of a little bit of a strange family. It was a 90-something-year-old mother and her adult children who lived with her, who were all in their 60s. And one of the children, Michael, he was just known in the area about being a little bit odd. Like, he would just kind of creep out other people. It wasn't uncommon to have him like walk across people's property, like little things like that, like looking in windows, just giving the vibe that he was a little bit strange and people didn't really like being around him. So Derek brings it up to the police that, "Hey, you should look into Michael Langford. He lives right near us. Neighbors are saying he's a little bit off." The police were like, "Actually, he was the first person we talked to. We brought him in, we questioned him, he denied it, we have no evidence tying him to it, and we just don't think it's him." And then later on in the investigation, they would actually do a DNA sample from one of the letters, and they would find out that it was a woman's DNA. And so that effectively ruled out Michael Langford, but the Langfords had a daughter. And so they decided maybe it could be her. And so they actually got a water bottle from her that they found, and they tested that, and it wasn't a match. So the Langfords were ruled out. Derek is growing increasingly more paranoid and angry. You know, he went from being, scared of what was potentially going to happen to feeling like, how dare you threaten my family, my kids? And he started telling the police, like, if you don't find who's doing this, I'm going to figure out who it is. And then you're not going to be dealing with, a stalking case. You're going to be dealing with a different kind of case, if you catch my drift. And so the police were like, don't do anything crazy. We're working as hard as we can. It's just there's not much to go on here. Derek wasn't okay with that. He set up this elaborate camera system in and around his house, the new house. He started staying at the new house, turning off all the lights and crouching behind windows and staring at the mailbox in hopes of being able to confront anybody who went near it. He ended up hiring 2 former FBI agents to launch his own private investigation. He hired a handwriting expert to analyze the letters themselves to see if they could pick up details about who this was and potentially profile them. And this person, all they could conclude was it was someone who was really, really mad. But all those things really didn't lead to any results. It was just Derek had become obsessed, and he was willing to basically do anything to find out who the heck is writing these letters. So at this point, the Broadduses had already sold their old house. They were still living in it because they hadn't moved into the new house, the house being watched. But at some point, the new owners of the house they sold were ready to move in. And so the Broadduses had to move in with Maria's family, but were still paying the mortgage on 657 Boulevard. At this point, the community started kind of spreading rumors about the Broaddus family. People believed that the reason they weren't moving into this beautiful new home was, they were getting a divorce, or they had some legal problems. The letters and what was going on with these letters, that was not widely known. There was speculation about it, but no one really knew for sure. So Derek and Maria kind of gradually became pariahs, and they ultimately decided that they're just going to sell this house, this new house they purchased, because they need the money. They've tied up a lot of money in it, and they feel like, we'll sell the house and we'll move on. But by the time they listed it, enough rumors were circulating about the weirdness around that house and why no one was moving into it, and the weirdness with Derek and Maria, that nobody wanted to buy. And so they initially list this property above what they paid because they'd put $100,000 into the house in renovations. They just kept doing renovations, and that was their way of justifying not moving in. And they were like, we'll keep fixing it up. It'll be better once we move in. But, so they put $100K in, and no one bid. They lower the price, no one bid. They continued to lower the price to where it was like a full-blown deficit. Still, no one made an offer. So it sat vacant. At this point, Maria and Derek turned their frustration towards the previous owners, because as I mentioned earlier, they had received a letter from the Watcher. Granted, it was, at the very end of their stay in this house, but it was before they gave over the keys to the Broaddus family. And Derek and Maria felt like the fact that they got an anonymous letter that was literally signed The Watcher, that name alone was kind of ominous enough that they felt like the Woods family should have disclosed that to the Broaddus family before they moved in. And so they filed a legal complaint against the Woods family, basically saying that you held information that potentially would have kept us from moving in and not having this problem. Well, Derek and Maria were assured by their legal team that at most, a small legal newswire might pick up this lawsuit, and that would be it. But the story, it got picked up by a number of outlets. The fact that they were filing a complaint against the previous owners over basically a stalker. And all of a sudden, they were all over the news. The Broaddus family had over 300 media requests. There were TV stations and news stations camped out on their front lawn. Everybody wanted to know what's going on with this bizarre, Watcher. It became this huge thing. And so for Derek and Maria and their family, they had to vacate Westfield because it was basically not only unsafe because they were being watched by this phantom menace, But now, like, they couldn't escape the media pressure and all the speculation from their nosy neighbors. It was just a total train wreck. Finally, the Broaddus family got some good news. Literally years after this first letter is sent and they tied up all their money in this new house, a family agrees to rent the house. Now, this is going to be at a loss for the Broaddus family. The rent money will not even cover the mortgage. But to them, who've just been sitting on this worthless property that's just been, eating away at their finances, this was a huge win. The Broaddus family, they put into the contract with this new family that, hey, you know what's going on here with the Watcher. If you get another letter, you're able to renege on this contract. And so the new family moves in, and 2 weeks into being there, what do you think happens? Another letter shows up.
You wonder who the Watcher is. Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the Watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. My soldiers of the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and they saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher.
The renter was also mentioned in this letter and was definitely spooked. But they decide that they're still willing to stick around because they knew going in this could happen. They just asked that the Broaddus family install even more cameras. And so they did that, they installed more cameras, and they decided to stay. Derek and Maria are obviously disheartened, but at the same time, now they have more evidence against the Watcher. And so they take this new letter, they bring it to the police, and unfortunately, much like the other few letters they'd received, there was nothing much to go on, except that you have this person claiming to watch them, but no hard evidence to tie it to anybody. So once again, they got nowhere. After renting this house out for a while to this family at a deficit, the Broaddus family in 2019 finally decide to just sell the house at a $400,000 deficit. It was just a huge nightmare, and at this point they were willing to pay $400,000 to get rid of it. Before they sold it, they received one more letter, and this is what it said.
You are despised by the house, and the Watcher won.
Despite the investigation by police and the unofficial investigation by Derek's private investigators, we are not anywhere closer to figuring out who the Watcher is, or what's hidden in the walls. It's all still a huge mystery. Many people have speculated that the Broaddus family, that Derek specifically, was probably the person who wrote the letters, because in fact, he would later admit that he wrote a number of anonymous letters to people in the community that had been bad-mouthing he and his family. But he said it was purely out of frustration. And the unofficial investigation by Derek's private investigators, we are not anywhere closer to figuring out who the Watcher is, or what's hidden in the walls. It's all still a huge mystery. Many people have speculated that the Broaddus family, that Derek specifically, was probably the person who wrote the letters, because in fact, he would later admit that he wrote a number of anonymous letters to people in the community that had been bad-mouthing he and his family. But he said it was purely out of frustration. I wanted to scare them and make them, feel what it was like to have the Watcher watching them. But he said, this whole situation has really devastated them financially and emotionally, and, kind of ruined their ability to stay in the town that they loved so much. So it just, the angle that he stood to benefit from this, it's not a very good theory in my opinion. In addition, recently Netflix bought the rights to their story. But if Derek and his family had said, what we're going to do is we're going to set up this elaborate mystery around ourselves for years in order to secure movie rights, you'd be putting your kids through something so traumatic. And so the idea of having your kids have to live with the fear of being attacked and getting bullied at school because everybody talks in these communities, that seems far-fetched too. It remains to be seen who the Watcher is, but to this day it remains a mystery. So if you haven't already, please click like and subscribe. I am going to be trying to do 2 or more stories a week. I'm really making a push to make YouTube my primary, so I hope you'll tag along. If you want to talk to me separately, you can DM me on Instagram. That's JohnBallen416. Also, go follow me on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen. And that's going to do it, guys. I hope this was interesting, and I'll talk to you soon.
Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoors men and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. And it's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels, there's really nothing inside of it. And there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet, because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there is a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe, that literally overnight just was gone, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them. Or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribespeople have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, 3 brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured because so few people had ever been inside of this valley, that if there was gold to be found, then certainly it had not been found yet. And so after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs and trains and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the 3 brothers, they're on their boat, they're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is this long, skinny box that's usually made of wood, and it has a strainer on one side. And gold miners will put it in the water submerged, and they will kind of shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel, and the big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and the water will just kind of flow out the side. And so the idea is you can trap gold nuggets inside of this sluice. And so the 3 brothers, they get their sluices up and they start looking for gold, and right away they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning they do the same thing. And by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim with gold, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. And so they pack up their tent, they pack up all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point, very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, like their rifle and some lumber and some of their mining supplies, and they swim it all to shore. So they catch their breath. They're totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they're alive. They have enough supplies to survive. And so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and then, regroup and come back another time. And so using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat and then hopped back on the Flat River, and they went back up to that site where they had found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time they didn't find any gold. So all day, this very disappointing day that they've already lost all their gold, now they're not finding any more gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. And so the next day they get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold, because now they know there's gold out there. It's not a question, yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there. Charlie, the older brother, he wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go, I'm going to stay. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley. And finally, in 1905, they're ready. And so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, who was a friend of theirs, he was going to replace Charlie. The three of them, they make their way up into the valley. Now, they didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned because he knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, and so he figured they must have struck it rich, and now they've decided to live out there long term, or at least maybe through the summer, or maybe the next year. And so he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. And so weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men. No one's heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert, but still Charlie maintains that nothing can be wrong because there's three of them out there. They're incredibly experienced. There is a ton of gold out there. I'm sure they're just killing it and they're just acquiring all this gold, and we're going to see them in the next couple of months maybe, and everything's going to be just fine. But a whole other year would go by, so they've been out there for 2 years and no one has heard from them. And at this point, Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people from his town and he mounts an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to go find his 2 brothers and find Robert Weir. Charlie and his search party eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, they get into Nahanni Valley and they get onto the Flat River. And so they start making their way upstream along Flat River. So it must have been a very treacherous journey getting through the rapids of this river. And the whole time they're scanning the left and the right side, hoping to see some sign of life. They're looking for any indication that these 3 men are out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. And once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. And again, they're looking on either side for any sign of these 3 men. There's no sign of them. And then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn. It's actually called the Big Bend. And it's about a 45-degree turn. And as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through. And they're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. And these canyons are massive. These sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot up to 3,000 feet above the water. And in some parts, the water is actually just as deep, thousands of feet deep. And Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're going to get. And the cliff faces almost butt up exactly up against the water. So there's really very little shoreline on either side. So once you're in this 10-mile stretch, you're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you. You have these massive cliffs on either side, and there's really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from being in your boat. And along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides that are openings to these massive cave systems inside of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. And because of how difficult it is to not only get to Nahanni Valley, but also to get up to these different cave openings, nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves, save for the few that are down low enough that people can explore. So as you're passing through Second Canyon, it's almost like you're being watched because there's all of these openings, but you can't see into them, and you're just forced to go down this 10-mile stretch, and you can't really go anywhere, and whatever's watching you, it's watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker, because that's another part of being in Second Canyon. These huge cliff walls of this canyon obscure the sunlight. And so they would have entered into this canyon, it would have gotten darker, and it's very windy inside of Second Canyon. So the winds would have picked up, so it's dark, very strange setting for them to be in, and they would have been looking on either side at these little strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be. They would have been looking for any sign of life, but they didn't see anything. As they're making their way down this 10-mile stretch, as they're getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, which is the next canyon you would enter into, the sides of the river start to get slightly larger where you could actually beach a boat. There's some trees, and on the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they notice there is actually a tent perched within some trees. And so the search party naturally goes right over to the shoreline, they hop out, but as soon as they step foot on land and they have a clearer view of this tent and what's outside of it, they notice there is a body clearly lying on the ground outside of the tent. And so Charlie and the search party, they run over, and as soon as they're up close, they can tell this body is missing its head. And they see the clothes on this body are totally charred and burned, and whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died. And right outside of the reach of their right arm was a rifle that was propped up against a tree. And so they walk around this one body and they go around towards the backside of the tent where the opening to this tent is, and they find another body, another very badly decomposed body, and it's positioned kind of halfway in the tent and halfway out of the tent. And there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body, and when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. So Charlie and the search party, they continue to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they are, but they never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent, that way in the tent and halfway out of the tent. And there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body, and when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. So Charlie and the search party, they continue to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they are, but they never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent that would confirm these are Charlie's brothers. As for the third man that had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite, and in fact, he would never actually be found officially. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later that was attributed to Robert. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree, and it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them or in their camp or in the river nearby, nothing. There was no gold. Charlie and his search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation, and ultimately they would come to the conclusion that all three of these men, the two brothers and Robert, had starved to death, and then after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. They said this was a natural thing, this was an accident, and so that's that. When the story of these two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy about this. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people that believed that partial skeleton that was found, that was not Robert Weir. He had not died. He had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by a person, a group of people, an animal, a creature, something. There was some sort of attack. And that's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leapt from his bed before he ultimately died. But regardless of which side you fell on, pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so actually that stretch got renamed the Headless Valley, and from that point forward, that's all it was known as. And so even though there were obvious gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni River and the Flat River, people after the story broke were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so people kind of stayed away from Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided, you know what? I'm not going to let some scary stories about some headless men and, ghosts and killers on the loose. I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. So all on his own, Martin makes the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He makes his way up Flat River, and he finally finds a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was. And he actually built a one-room cabin, because he was going to stay there through the winter, and then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so right after he got there, he set up his sluices and he started mining for gold, and apparently he found a lot of it, because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. And so his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got, because they planned on going back into the valley with him that summer. So that summer rolls around, his partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. And so his partners, they stay outside at this meeting space for several days until finally, when he doesn't show up, they decide, we have to go in there and see if he is okay, because at this point he should have been here. There's no excuse. And so they end up going into the Nahanni Valley. They make their way up Flat River, and they go roughly to the area where they knew he was staying based on the message he had sent earlier. He had described where he was staying, and they actually found his cabin, or I should say they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground, and laying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the burned out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths, even though they were all decapitated. They were in roughly the same area, and it happened within a few years of each other, and they looked very, very similar. Even though that all was true, the police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull is missing. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy, and despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though the police were saying that, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that have happened close together in a relatively short time frame, and so a lot of people assumed there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what? Despite the rumors of the so-called killer or whatever's going on in the Nahanni Valley, let's go into the Nahanni Valley and try our hand. Let's try to get some gold. And so the two of them made their way into the valley, and they set up camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found decapitated. So they set up their camp, and they're there for a couple of days. They're doing well. They're finding gold. And then at some point, John tells his partner that he's going to go out and check all of their traps along the river, and he'll be back in about 8 or 9 days. And so his partner waits 8 or 9 days, and John doesn't come back. And a couple of days after that goes by, and now John's past due, and so the partner decides he has to go out looking for him. And so there was another gold prospector in the area. And so this partner contacted him, and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream until they found John. And he had frozen to death, but it was very interesting the way he was positioned. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over. He didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there enjoying the fire when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, they would say, this is odd. This is odd the way he's positioned, but ultimately he died because he froze to death, and so there's no foul play here, and so no further investigation is needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. And so that night, they're all kind of joking around the fire, and then at some point they decide to all go to sleep. And then the next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp. And there's no sign of where she went. And so they begin by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see maybe if she stepped away for a minute, but Annie's just gone, and no one knows where she went. So the hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley. They tell police. Police come out. There's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. So he goes to police and he explains that night when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them, he knew they were over there. He said at some point he went to bed and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. So he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight, and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it, and then he hears it again and he can tell it's off to his left. And these are not huge rocks. These are like medium to small sized rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he's looking, and all of a sudden he sees, maybe a couple hundred yards away through some sparse trees, he sees a naked woman, a white naked woman, running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. She's right on the edge of this cliff. And as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns, and he gets a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. And so the police, they take this story down and they say, hey, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so universally, it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night naked was Annie. Police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she'd already been gone for months, and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decides to try their luck in Headless Valley. A man named Phil Powers. He makes his way into the valley. He finds a spot off of Flat River. He builds a cabin, and then shortly thereafter, his cabin burns to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was just all one big accident. But the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point with all of these strange deaths, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, They entered the Headless Valley to try their luck, and shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground, but William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Savard entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold, and then when he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him, and they would find him inside of his sleeping bag, laying down, decapitated, right along the flat river inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident where, he starved to death or he died of hypothermia. And then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why we can't find it. And so the police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley, and he went missing. And so a search party went in looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River, some native tribespeople came into their camp, and they warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river, they're out in the forest, they're kind of all around here, and so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribespeople just left. And so the search party is absolutely horrified. They know about the rumors of this place. They're out here looking for someone that's gone missing in this place. And all night, all they hear are distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard in the previous nights. They're hearing these wailing sounds coming from all around them, like these things that are out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that constant wailing they heard the night before, he said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far less people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park. But other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody knows why. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the 5-star review button over to your kid's birthday party and then ask them if they want to hit the piñata. When they say yes, put their blindfold on and then replace the piñata with a beehive. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. Night in June of 2020 in Sandusky, Ohio, and 25-year-old Lauren Wells lay in her bed wide awake. She had to be up early for work and had been trying to fall asleep for hours, but all night long, the faint sound of music coming from her upstairs neighbors had made sleep impossible. The tune they kept playing was extremely irritating. Sometimes it was very generic sounding, like elevator music. Then it seemed to switch to some kind of strange experimental jazz. Lauren had just moved into her apartment and didn't want to cause any trouble with her new neighbors, but they clearly were not stopping anytime soon. So she finally climbed out of bed and grabbed her broom. She was just about to knock on the ceiling with her broom when the direction of the music suddenly changed. Now it sounded like it was coming from next door. Lauren shook her head in frustration. She didn't want to start a fight with the entire complex, so she climbed back into her bed and threw her pillow over her head. She could still hear the music, but eventually she drifted off to sleep. The next morning at 8 a.m., Lauren arrived at her job as a nursing home administrator. She had just been hired 2 months ago, and she was proud that she'd gotten this position at such a young age. Running the nursing home was Lauren's dream job. She loved interacting with the elderly residents and wanted to make a difference in their lives. So even though she was running on fumes at this point from a lack of sleep, Lauren pushed through the day, checking in on staff and residents, and running various meetings. Thankfully, it was a Friday, so Lauren had the weekend to look forward to. She and her friends were heading to one of the islands off of Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes. Lauren hoped some time outdoors would help her regain some energy. And the weekend getaway was just what she needed. The sun was out, there was a gentle breeze over the lake, and the water was cool and refreshing. Lauren was excited to reconnect with her best friends, and on their first night out, they went out to dance and have some drinks. She forgot about work and her annoying neighbors and just enjoyed herself. But as the evening progressed, Lauren found herself using the bathroom more than usual, but she figured it was just because she was drinking. A little while later, when she was on the dance floor, she felt a sharp pain on her left side. The pain stayed with her the rest of the night. She thought it was menstrual cramps and did her best to ignore them. Nothing was going to stop her from having a fun weekend. And by the time she got home Sunday night, she was feeling better, just like she had hoped. But soon after Lauren stepped into her apartment, her good mood evaporated. Her neighbors were playing that annoying elevator music again. The faint melody seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Lauren dropped her bags and shook her head. She wasn't going to let this upset her. It was late and she knew she needed to get some sleep. So she unpacked and got ready for bed. But just like before, it was impossible to relax with that music coming through the walls. She tossed and turned for hours until finally exhaustion overtook her. When Monday morning rolled around, Lauren was definitely not feeling well. She figured she was paying for her weekend of partying, so she tried to shake it off. She made herself a cup of coffee and got on the treadmill for her daily run. But she'd only been on the treadmill for a minute when once again she felt an intense pain in her left side and had to stop running. It almost felt like someone was punching her hard, but from the inside. This pain went far beyond menstrual cramps. She figured something else had to be going on. Lauren thought back to everything she did at Lake Erie. She wondered if she had pulled a muscle while she was out swimming. It didn't seem likely, but she couldn't think of anything else that would explain the pain. Lauren had no idea how she was going to get through the day, much less the week, but she didn't want to call in sick. She was still new to her job, and people were counting on her. So she slowly got dressed while wincing in pain and got ready for work. And as she did, she thought to herself, at least her neighbors weren't playing that god-awful music. Once Lauren arrived at work, she did her morning rounds and sat down at her desk to take care of some paperwork. But as hard as she tried, she just couldn't focus. There was something distracting her. It was that weird music she kept hearing in her apartment. It made no sense that the same music would be playing in the nursing home. Lauren looked around just to see if there were any speakers nearby, but there was none. She tried to ignore the disjointed melody, but it was impossible. It seemed like it was coming from everywhere. But then she realized something that made her heart start racing. If there really wasn't any music actually playing right now, that could only mean one thing. The music was only happening in her head. She wondered if she was going crazy. But before she jumped to any conclusions, Lauren thought of someone who might be able to help her. She had a friend who was an audiologist, which is a doctor that specializes in hearing. Lauren called her right away and explained what was going on. She described the strange, repetitive sound and said it was following her everywhere. Lauren's friend listened patiently, then told her that what she was describing sounded upsetting, but it actually wasn't uncommon. She promised that Lauren was not going crazy. She said that sometimes people can hear melodies in everyday noises like busy traffic or the hum of air conditioners, and just like songs that get stuck in your head, these sounds can do the same thing. Since Lauren was clearly so tired, she was probably more susceptible to hearing these noises. Her friend was sure that once Lauren just got some quality sleep, this weird music she was hearing would go away. Lauren was relieved, but also frustrated. The music was actually the thing keeping her from sleeping in the first place. But she was glad to know that if she could just get some rest, maybe her life would go back to normal. As the week went by, Lauren did her best to stay relaxed, but the music in her head just would not stop, and it continued to make sleep nearly impossible. And so a few days after talking to her friend, Lauren again dragged herself to work, and as she headed down the hall toward her office, she noticed a new odd sensation. Her hands felt like they were covered in a thick layer of dirt, and they felt sticky too, almost as if a glue stick had melted in her palm. She kept scrubbing her hands with soap and hot water, but she couldn't get them to feel clean. Lauren was totally confused. She'd never felt anything like this before. And it wasn't long before that same sensation spread to her feet. Lauren felt like her socks were glued to her toes. At first, it was just a little bit irritating, but then it became totally unbearable. She started going barefoot at work, which helped a little bit. She realized it was weird, but she couldn't stand the thought of putting her shoes and socks back on. Lauren was afraid that there was a connection between her auditory hallucinations and now her hands and feet feeling dirty all the time. But she had no idea what that connection could be. Lauren's instinct was telling her to go see a doctor, but she imagined how ridiculous it would all sound. She hung on to what her friend, the audiologist, had told her about feeling better with some rest. And so Lauren convinced herself that this was the weekend she would finally get some sleep and all these problems would just finally go away. That Saturday night, more than 2 weeks after her strange symptoms had begun, Lauren climbed into bed exhausted. She tried to ignore the strange soundtrack playing in her head, her sticky hands and feet, and the dull pain still in her left side. She pulled the comforter up to her chin, and she tried to meditate, letting the sounds of birds outside her window lull her to sleep. But after a few minutes, Lauren's eyes flew open. She realized that the birds singing outside her window were seagulls. Seagulls live near water, and there was not an ocean or a lake anywhere near her. The seagulls got louder and louder, and finally sounded like they might just fly right into her room at any second. Lauren knew that no amount of rest was going to make them go away, because just like the music, these squawking seagulls were in her head. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to see a doctor. Almost 500 miles away in Easton, Pennsylvania, Lauren's father, Brad, was sound asleep at home when his phone rang. He saw Lauren's name on the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. She wouldn't be calling so late if something wasn't wrong. After he answered the phone, Lauren told him what had been going on for the past couple of weeks. She had reached the point where she was so worried about her symptoms that she was heading to the emergency room to get checked out. Brad could hear the panic in her voice, and that made him scared. He was fully awake now, calculating how long it would take him to drive to Ohio. He jumped out of bed and reached for his clothes, telling Lauren he was on his way, but she told him he should stay home. She wanted to see what the doctor had to say before he made such a long trip. Brad reluctantly agreed to hold off, but he told Lauren to call as soon as she had any answers. 30 minutes after talking to her father, Lauren arrived at the emergency room. She took a breath and then described her symptoms to the admissions nurse, expecting to get some strange looks. But the nurse just nodded and took some notes. Then Lauren was sent back to see a doctor who performed an exam and drew her blood. Lauren waited anxiously as they processed her results. and after a little while, the doctor approached Lauren's hospital bed. She searched his face, looking for any sign of concern, but his expression seemed totally relaxed. He told Lauren that her tests were completely normal. He didn't think anything was really wrong with her. As he spoke, he flipped through her chart and asked about her work. She explained she'd recently moved and started a new job. The doctor nodded and said he understood, and he said, Lauren, you're probably just stressed. And then he prescribed her some anti-anxiety medication, and he gave her an order to see a psychiatrist. Lauren was frustrated with the doctor's diagnosis, but he seemed to be certain there wasn't anything else going on with her. So Lauren left the ER feeling somewhat unsettled, and on the way home, she called her father, Brad. Lauren could always rely on him to be supportive and honest with her. She told him how annoyed she was that all these doctors just assumed she was stressed because of her new job. But she was thriving there and loved the new challenge. It didn't make sense to put the blame solely on stress. Her dad said he totally understood her frustration, but the doctors knew what they were doing. He asked Lauren to at least start taking the anti-anxiety medication. With any luck, they'd let her get some sleep, and then at that point, with a clear head, she could reassess her situation. Lauren was not convinced, but she promised her dad that she would try. Later that week, Lauren drove to work as usual. She'd been taking her anxiety medication, but so far, it really wasn't helping. She still heard all the mysterious music playing everywhere she went, and so she really wasn't getting more than an hour or two of sleep at night. She gulped down some strong black coffee, but nothing could cut through her brain fog. She'd been a zombie at work all week, often losing track of what she was supposed to be doing. Lauren turned into the parking lot, pulled into her parking spot, and then got out of her car, and as she walked towards the building, she left the engine running and her keys in the ignition, and her laptop and purse were still on the passenger seat. Lauren entered the conference room in a daze. She felt like she was moving in slow motion, and she barely registered the team of nurses who were already there for the weekly staff meeting. Lauren sat down at the table and tried to read the agenda, but the words looked like a jumble of hieroglyphics. At some point, Lauren tried to say something, but nothing came out of her mouth. She looked at the faces of her colleagues, who were now staring at her in confusion, and suddenly, Lauren realized she had no idea how she had gotten there or what she was supposed to do. The nurses who were at the meeting with Lauren could tell something was wrong with her. They helped Lauren lie down on a nearby sofa and took her blood pressure, which was extremely high. She could hear another nurse calling 911. Lauren tried not to panic, but the fear was overwhelming. Then her mind went totally blank. By the time the ambulance arrived, Lauren was starting to come out of her trance-like state. The fog that had been clouding her mind had lifted, and she felt more clear-headed than she had in a long time. She insisted that she did not need to go to the hospital, but the staff wouldn't hear of it. And so, after some gentle coaxing, they convinced Lauren to get in the ambulance. The paramedics took Lauren to a local hospital where doctors ran a series of tests. As she waited for the results, she felt surprisingly calm. She was so relaxed that she began texting her friends to come hang out with her in the hospital. She said she was having a great time. Lauren's friends were taken aback by these text messages. They knew what she was going through, and this just didn't sound like her at all. A little while later, Lauren's father, Brad, was busy at work when his cell phone rang. He'd been on edge the whole week, worrying about his daughter. When he saw it wasn't her number, he felt relieved. Then she turned to her friend and said that it must have been another false alarm. But Lauren could tell her friend still looked worried. And deep in her heart, Lauren knew she wasn't okay, no matter what these tests said. Her symptoms might have temporarily gone away, but they were going to return, and as she thought about that, she began to feel this terrible dread come over her. Lauren asked the doctor if there was any other alternative to being discharged. The doctor hesitated, and then he said yes, there was, but it was drastic. Seven hours later, Brad finally arrived at the hospital in Sandusky, and he raced to the admissions desk. Just moments earlier, his daughter had called him with the stunning news that she was admitting herself into the psychiatric ward of the hospital, and so Brad, all he wanted to do was just get to his daughter. Once he entered the patient area, Brad was greeted by a doctor and brought to Lauren's room, but he was only allowed to see her through a shatterproof glass window on her locked door, and what he saw shook him to the core. Lauren was writhing on the floor, screaming and begging to be let out. She was trying to tear off her shirt, food was splattered on the walls, and an empty tray and plate were upside down on the floor. Brad was stunned. Lauren had called him just a couple of hours earlier and seemed fairly clear-headed, and so he didn't understand how her condition could have changed so drastically. The doctor explained that he was giving Lauren medicine to treat schizophrenia, which is a serious mental disorder that causes people to hallucinate and experience delusions. They'd already started on her medication, but it would need time to take effect. Brad shook his head in disbelief. There was no history of mental illness in their family, and Lauren had always been so happy and well-adjusted. The doctor could only shrug. Schizophrenia did have a tendency to run in families, but it also struck out of the blue, usually in young adults anytime between their late teens and early 20s, and Lauren was 25. The diagnosis was terrifying. Brad was desperate to do something to help, but all he could do was wait for Lauren's medication to kick in. It was early in the morning when Brad left the hospital after Lauren had finally calmed down. He checked into a nearby hotel and sank into an exhausted sleep, thinking about his daughter and praying that she would be back to her normal self by the time he woke up. After sleeping for a few hours, Brad returned to the hospital, and when he got there, the nurse gave him a rundown of Lauren's condition. She said Lauren had begged the staff to use their hospital phone, and then when they said yes, she had called friends and relatives repeatedly, forgetting she'd already spoken with them. She'd also become very aggressive with the hospital staff. Brad insisted on going into his daughter's room, so they unlocked her door and he walked in softly, not wanting to scare her. Lauren was sitting on a rumpled bed staring into the distance. Her hair was disheveled and there were dark circles under her eyes. He almost didn't even recognize her. Brad struggled to stay calm as he sat down next to Lauren. He tried to comfort her and asked her if she needed anything, but she didn't respond. The medications she was on didn't seem to be working, but the doctor said it could take a while to kick in. Without anything else to hold on to, Brad clung on to that hope. Over the next few days, Brad anxiously waited for Lauren to improve as doctors tried different combinations of medications. But on the 5th night after Lauren was admitted to the psych ward, things got even worse. Brad had gone back to his hotel, and in a routine that had become too familiar, a phone call startled him awake. It was someone from the hospital. Lauren had experienced a massive seizure and was being transferred to the ICU for further testing. Brad ran to his car, and by the time he arrived at the ICU, Lauren was heavily sedated. He flagged down a doctor in the hall and bombarded her with questions, but it was clear that the doctor was just as much in the dark as he was. All she knew was that Lauren was in critical condition and they were trying to figure out what was wrong. Afterward, in the waiting room, Brad called friends and family to update them. He tried to piece together everything that had happened to her in the last several weeks, hunting for any clues that might explain her illness, but all he had was a long list of strange symptoms and events. Brad didn't know what to do, but he was desperate for answers, and so he began mentally going through his list of friends who might have some perspective that could be useful right now about Lauren. And as he did this, one name came up that he and Lauren both had in common: Ken Zemanek. Ken was the father of twin girls who were Lauren's best friends from childhood, and he was also a psychiatrist. And so Brad hoped Ken could provide some perspective about Lauren's mental state. When he got Ken on the phone, Brad was afraid that Ken would tell him the same things as all the other doctors, that it was possible Lauren had schizophrenia, or that Brad just needed to be patient and wait for more test results. But once Brad finished going through Lauren's extensive list of strange symptoms, Ken didn't say a word. After a long pause, he said that the hallucinations and mood swings did point to a mental issue. But what troubled Ken was the seizure. Schizophrenia couldn't have caused that to happen. Ken paused again, and then told Brad he did have another thought, one that could potentially explain everything that had been happening to Lauren. He described it as a, quote, rare bird or extremely rare condition. He suggested that Brad ask Lauren's doctors to test her for this rare condition. Brad listened intently. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. After Brad hung up with Ken, Brad Googled anything he could find about this rare disease Ken had mentioned. And the more he read about it, the more convinced he became that it was what was happening to Lauren. Brad headed straight to the nurse's station and asked to speak with one of Lauren's doctors right away. For the first time since Lauren's nightmare had started, he felt a real glimmer of hope. The on-duty doctor arrived, and Brad told him about his conversation with Ken Zemanek, but the doctor was hesitant to test for it right away. The condition Brad described was incredibly unusual, and they needed to test for more common conditions first. Brad immediately tried speaking with another one of Lauren's doctors to see if maybe they would test for it, but that doctor said the same thing. They were going to test for common things first, and this doctor would say that in their entire career, they had never seen a patient with something that rare before. And so a parade of specialists marched in and out of Lauren's room, but every test they ran was inconclusive. As the hours ticked by, Brad's frustration grew. The next morning, Brad arrived at the hospital and headed straight to the ICU. As he walked down the hallway leading to Lauren's room, he heard a commotion of voices and the sound of beeping monitors. He ran into his daughter's room and saw a team of doctors hovering over Lauren. She was lying motionless on the bed and her eyes were closed. Brad stood there in shocked silence until a doctor noticed him and rushed over. He told Brad that Lauren's vital signs were dropping and they were working to get her stabilized. And so Brad needed to leave and go to the waiting area until the situation was under control. But Brad was sick of waiting in a medical twilight zone. His daughter was on the verge of death and they still had no idea what was wrong with her. He demanded they run the tests that he had requested about this rare illness. The doctor hesitated, but then nodded. He finally admitted that they were hitting a total brick wall and were at an absolute loss. But they were at a small community hospital, and so their resources were very limited to both test and treat Lauren for this rare condition if she were to have it. And so if Brad wanted to get her the help she needed, they'd have to transfer her to the Cleveland clinic, which was over an hour away. However, getting there was a huge risk. Lauren was so weak she could die on the transit. Brad was facing the biggest decision of his life, but he didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, Lauren was loaded into the back of an ambulance, headed for the Cleveland clinic. Brad followed behind in his car, praying his daughter could hold on just a little longer. When the ambulance finally arrived at the clinic, a medical team was waiting. Brad quickly parked his car and joined them as the team grabbed the gurney that Lauren was on and rushed her towards the entrance. Brad tried to stay calm as he watched them wheel her to the neurological ICU. Lauren's heartbeat barely registered, and she was having trouble breathing on her own. The doctors told Brad that her brain had also begun to swell, and so they needed to put her into a medically induced coma to help bring the swelling down. Lauren was given a strong sedative through an IV drip to put her into a state of unconsciousness. She was then hooked up to a ventilator that went into her mouth and down her throat to keep her breathing, and a feeding tube was inserted inside her nose and down into her stomach. Brad tried not to show how scared he was, but he knew Lauren was hanging on by a thread. Brad spent the next several hours anxiously pacing in the lobby of the ICU while the heads of several departments at the Cleveland Clinic teamed up in an attempt to save Lauren's life. Finally, one of Lauren's doctors walked in with the results of Lauren's newest round of tests. The doctor was incredulous. Brad and his good friend, Ken Zemanek, had been right. Lauren was sick with something that was so unheard of, most doctors would never think to even test for it. She had a disease called anti-NMDAR encephalitis. Anti-NMDAR is extremely rare, affecting only 1 out of 1.5 million people per year. It had only been identified 13 years earlier in 2007. The disease causes severe inflammation of the brain, which then results in hallucinations and a total psychotic breakdown. This explained almost all of Lauren's symptoms, like hearing the strange music and the seagulls and the sticky feelings on her hands and feet. But it turned out that NMDAR by itself wasn't what caused Lauren to get so sick. The doctor explained that the disease usually signified a deeper, even rarer underlying condition, which would have caused Lauren's other symptoms, like the pain in her side and the frequent need to urinate. Those symptoms were caused by a tumor in her ovary called a teratoma. Teratomas usually strike young women. This kind of tumor is made up of tissue from other parts of the body, like hair, muscle, nerve, organ, or bone. Normally, when the immune system recognizes a tumor in the body, it creates antibodies to try and kill it off. However, the specific type of antibodies formed from a teratoma can end up targeting more than just the tumor. They can also attack the brain and cause anti-NMDAR. In trying to defend her body against this tumor, Lauren's brain had accidentally attacked itself. Brad nearly collapsed from relief. They had a clear-cut answer for what Lauren was up against. It meant they weren't working in the dark. Now they just needed to get the tumor out. A surgeon removed the teratoma the next morning. It was 13 centimeters long, so more than 5 inches long. And unfortunately, it was malignant, which meant Lauren needed chemotherapy in order to fully recover. For the next 2 weeks, Lauren stayed in a medically induced coma. Once she was finally awakened, she couldn't remember anything that had happened to her. She had to relearn how to walk and how to talk, but day by day she got stronger and was finally well enough to go home. 6 months later, Lauren got the news they'd all been hoping for. She was now officially cancer-free. After a full recovery, she went on to graduate from school and earned an advanced degree. Then, in April of 2022, she took a new job as executive director of a senior living facility. She never heard phantom elevator music or seagulls again. Two-year-old Russell Douglas climbed into the driver's seat of his bright yellow Chevy Tracker. Even though the forecast called for rain and clouds, there was nowhere Russell would rather have been than right where he was, on beautiful Whidbey Island, the place where Russell had spent most of his life years. Russell was not a person who had a lot of wonderful days, but on this particular morning, he was feeling better and happier than he had felt in a really long time. It was the day after Christmas, December 26th, 2003, and after a 7-month-long separation from Brenna and their 2 children, it now felt to Russell like he and his high school sweetheart might actually succeed in rebuilding their marriage and their relationship. Although Russell couldn't see any sign that Brenna was watching him leave or blowing him a kiss from a downstairs window, Russell still peered up at the house from the driver's seat and gave a wave and smiled before finally starting the engine and backing down the driveway. Even as he dropped his hand back down to the steering wheel, Russell knew that he was already expecting too much from Brenna. Russell had a habit of blaming circumstances, and in particular his mother and her strict upbringing, for many of the problems he experienced as an adult. But he was not blind to his own faults. Even before their separation, his marriage with Brenna had never been easy, which was one of the reasons why they waited almost a year after their first son Jack was born to get married. Russell knew that both he and Brenna were quick to get angry at each other, and Russell's habit of self-examination seemed like a waste of time to Brenna. To her, the questions that Russell jotted down to himself, like, "Why are you so afraid to just be without Brenna?" or "Why are you holding yourself and Brenna and the kids back?" were pointless. Russell just needed to make a decision one way or the other about their marriage and about what he wanted. Russell also knew he was subject to mood swings, and that he spent more time feeling depressed than he spent feeling upbeat. But no matter what he tried, therapy, the regular exercise that kept him trim and fit, writing those notes to himself, it still never took much for him to sink into a dark place. And Russell also knew that the chance he had now to try again with Brenna might be a very uphill struggle. Because during their separation, even though he had told himself that he'd use the time to think about their marriage, instead of actually doing that, almost immediately, Russell had struck up a new relationship with another woman, 50-year-old Marge Bailey. And even though their affair was over now, Russell knew it was still a huge sore spot for Brenna. But what Russell could never explain to Brenna was that that affair had actually helped him grow up and stop thinking of himself as a victim of his moods and of his overly strict and rigid upbringing. And when Russell had met Marge at a bar in the Washington resort town of Ocean Shores, shortly after he and Brenna had separated back in April of 2003, the last thing on his mind was a sexual relationship with Marge. But leaving Whidbey Island and his kids had been very difficult, and the small apartment he had rented in Renton, a suburb south of Seattle, was a typical and depressing bachelor pad, more like a storage container for his belongings than a home. And although his apartment was just 45 miles away from where Brenna lived with their kids, no sooner had Russell left the island that he felt the depression that he had always struggled with settle over him like a black cloud. So when Marge had walked up to Russell when he was sitting alone at the bar in Ocean Shores, he was grateful for her company. And right away, Russell and Marge had hit it off. It didn't take Russell long to discover that Marge was much more relaxed and open-minded than Brenna had been when it came to sex, and also when it came to Russell's own unconventional taste in clothes. If Russell wanted to wear a kilt or a sarong, a length of fabric that's tied around the waist like a skirt, that was fine with Marge. And if he wore pink spandex shorts and a gold necklace to his fitness club, that didn't bother her either. It was also fine with Marge that Russell was still married, and that he was not even sure if he wanted a divorce or not. And when Russell and Marge had finally ended their affair just a few weeks earlier, Marge had told him that if his marriage was really important to him, then he should try his best to fix it. So that's what Russell had decided he would do. According to the separation agreement that he and Brenna had worked out back in the spring, this was the Christmas that Russell was supposed to have 8-year-old Jack and 5-year-old Hannah. But when Russell had told Brenna that his affair with Marge was over, he'd also floated the idea to Brenna that he could just come to Whidbey Island over Christmas and all 4 of them, him and Brenna and their 2 kids, could spend the holiday together at their house in Langley. And Brenna had said yes. As Russell slowed down to make a left onto the main route that would lead him 13 miles west to Freeland, he looked down at his blue jeans and flannel shirt. Of course, along with agreeing to this Christmas reunion, Brenna had had a lot of other things to say as well, including the fact that she'd had enough of what she called Russell's deviant lifestyle. And by that, she didn't just mean his sense of adventure when it came to sex, but also his collection of slightly wild clothes. And even though Russell had been careful to dress in a style Brenna found acceptable during this reunion, he knew that since his arrival, he had already made at least one serious mistake. He'd been so excited about getting back together with Brenna that when he showed up for Christmas, he had given her some fancy lingerie, and inside the lingerie gift box, tucked under the folds of suggestive and flimsy fabric, he'd slipped an assortment of flavored condoms. Still, Brenna's annoyance with him had not stopped them from making love together earlier that very morning. And now, as Russell drove through some of the most beautiful landscapes in the Pacific Northwest, that voice inside him that constantly second-guessed his decisions and made him feel like happiness and contentment were always going to be out of his reach seemed to fade away. Not only was Russell back on his beloved Whidbey Island with Brenna and his kids, financially his life was also improving. He'd recently gotten a small, but to him very meaningful, promotion at the land management company where he worked, and in just 4 months, he'd finish his online master's degree in business administration. He knew that the hairstyling business he and Brenna had bought together a year ago, so Brenna, a licensed beautician, could have her own salon, needed an infusion of cash to cover some debt Brenna had run up. But if they could make their marriage work, his skill with money management, coupled with her skills as a beautician, could put them on the path towards a comfortable financial future. He also knew that that kind of security and status was very important to Brenna. Even though she had never gone to college or spent really any time off of Whidbey Island, Brenna had a few close friends whose lives she envied. One of them was her best friend, Peggy Sue Thomas, who also happened to be a licensed hairstylist, as well as the owner of the house that Russell and Brenna rented in Langley. Although Russell had never been close friends with Peggy Sue, who was 4 years older than he and Brenna, it was impossible to grow up on Whidbey Island and not know about the 6-foot-tall high school basketball star from Langley with the outsized personality and fiery red hair. After high school, Peggy got married and then got her beautician license, just as Brenna would later do, But after Peggy's first marriage fell apart, she surprised everybody by joining the military and becoming one of the few female aircraft mechanics in the US Navy. After that, Peggy went on to marry a fellow veteran, and when she left the service, she raised 2 daughters, and in addition to working on and off as a hairstylist alongside Brenna, Peggy Sue also got a job as a car mechanic. And when her second marriage ended in divorce as well in the 1990s, Peggy Sue responded to the fact that her husband had left her for another woman by hitting the gym. By the year 2000, Peggy Sue had lost 100 pounds, and that year, she won the Mrs. Washington beauty pageant. And now Peggy Sue was out in Las Vegas, Nevada, living the high life with her 2 daughters. It was hard not to feel a little jealous of Peggy Sue with her confident good looks and her grit, but at least if Russell and Brenna could get their marriage straightened out, they could actually buy Peggy Sue's house, since that had been the original plan back when Peggy Sue had moved to Las Vegas and agreed to rent the house to him and Brenna. As Russell made yet another decision, he would definitely talk to Brenna about buying that house. He also made a quick mental review of the directions he needed to follow to get to his next destination, an address on Wall Road just outside of Freeland. He was not familiar with this particular area he was going to. All he really knew was that Wall Road was about 4 miles outside of Freeland, and that lining the narrow roadway was a mixture of everything from churches to upscale homes and million-dollar getaway lodges for summer residents to rustic cabins and the occasional trailer. Looking out his car window at the hills that fell away to the ocean on his left, and catching a glimpse now and then between the trees of the white sailboats bobbing out on Puget Sound, Russell thought of the hikes he could take here with his children. Much as Russell had enjoyed his brief time with his lover Marge, he was now feeling like the separation had finally shown him how important his wife Brenna was in his life, the one constant that had given him more happiness and security than anything else. For Russell, that insight alone had felt like a huge win, and as he thought about it, he bumped the steering wheel with his fist in a gesture of celebration that he felt so ready to make this reconciliation with Brenna work for both of them. As Russell neared his destination, he slowed and began looking to the left and the right for the landmarks that would confirm he was in the right place. As he did this, he reminded himself that he just needed to be patient and give Brenna the time she needed to accept him back into her life. A little bit distracted by this thought, Russell turned into what turned out to be the wrong driveway. He knew he had made a mistake when he saw a red Volvo parked up ahead of him. He'd been told to look for an empty driveway. So he immediately stopped his car, he backed up, and resumed driving west on Wall Road, but very slowly now since he knew he must be getting close to his destination. And sure enough, several hundred yards further along, Russell saw that he'd arrived at the right place, 6665 Wall Road. He turned his Chevy Tracker onto the long driveway and drove to the end of it, where he pulled off to the right side into a parking spot that was at a right angle to the driveway. Beside him were 2 fir trees that cast a dark shadow over his vehicle. But before Russell could pull off the sunglasses he always used when driving so he could see better into the thickly forested and shady area in front of him, he noticed a figure emerge from the woods in front of him, and this person began walking directly toward him. Russell turned off his car engine, but before he could undo his seatbelt so he could get out of the car and greet this person, the person from the woods had rushed up right next to Russell's car door, blocking him from opening it. Russell turned to look at the stranger to see what they wanted, and when he realized what they were doing, he froze with fear. A few seconds later, and the world that Russell had finally begun piecing together in his mind for himself and his family ended in a sudden and terrific blow to his head. Almost 5 hours later, at about 4:30 p.m., 2 women who were residents of Freeland, who lived on Wall Road, were surprised to see a yellow Chevy Tracker parked in the driveway of one of their neighbors' houses. Not only was the car unfamiliar to them, but they could see in the near darkness that the driver's side door was open and the interior dome light of the car was still on. Also, the women knew that the owners of the house where the car was parked, the Black family, were not in town. They had gone to Costa Rica for a vacation. So the 2 women were very curious about who owned this yellow car and why they were there. However, none of the women wanted to approach this vehicle and anyone who might be inside of it when it was this dark outside and no one else was around. So the two women decided that if the car was still there tomorrow, they'd call the police. Then the two women just resumed their walk, made their way back to their own houses, and forgot about the bright yellow car with the open door. It wasn't until the afternoon of the next day, December 27th, that a dad out walking with his sons under a cloudy winter sky would also spot the yellow Chevy Tracker. Like the women who had been out walking the night before, Joseph Doucette, a schoolteacher who was staying with his family in a nearby cabin, was also immediately drawn to the car's open door. Joseph's first impulse was to walk over and shut the door before the interior light drained the car's battery, but when he called out and no one inside the car answered, he felt a sudden shiver of uneasiness, and instead of approaching the car right then, he turned around and took his kids back to the cabin. And then, at a slow run, he returned to the car alone. The cabin was also immediately drawn to the car's open door. Joseph's first impulse was to walk over and shut the door before the interior light drained the car's battery, but when he called out and no one inside the car answered, he felt a sudden shiver of uneasiness, and instead of approaching the car right then, he turned around and took his kids back to the cabin. And then, at a slow run, he returned to the car alone, feeling a mixture of urgency but also fear. Telling himself to get a grip, Joseph took a deep breath and then walked down the long driveway. When he reached the open car door and looked inside, what he saw was so shocking and gruesome, he practically fell backwards as he tried to step away. There was a man inside the yellow car. Joseph registered that the man was young with sandy blonde hair and that once he must have been handsome, but now something red and sticky was hanging from his forehead and the man's clothes were covered in blood. His head and shoulders were slumped over the steering wheel, and his hands lay in his lap, the fingers balled into tight fists. Trying to keep from vomiting, Joseph turned around and began running while pulling out his cell phone and dialing 911. And 8 minutes later, at 4:34 p.m., as the sun fell below the horizon, the first police car arrived on the scene. Not long after that, the dark, quiet road was filled with other police and emergency vehicles and flashing blue and red lights. It didn't take long for the first medical responders to realize they were too late. The man inside of the car was obviously dead, and he was obviously dead from a bullet wound to the head. And once detectives arrived on the scene, it didn't take them long to realize that their first assumption about what had happened to the driver of this car was completely wrong. Given the fact that the residence where this man was found was not only totally isolated, but looked obviously vacant, it would turn out the black family who owned the property really had been on vacation in Costa Rica at the time, and they would tell police they were not expecting anyone to be on their property while they were gone. And the fact that the driver was still buckled into his car seat, Detective Mike Plumberg's initial theory was that this must have been a suicide, that this man found this isolated place and this is where he took his life. Violent crimes on Whidbey Island were rare, but the suicide rate among islanders was actually pretty high, especially over the holidays. But even with the help of portable lighting that police used to illuminate the area around the car, officers could not find the one item that would even make suicide in this case a possibility, and that was the gun that had fired the fatal shot. But tucked away between the driver's seat and the door frame, Detective Plumberg did find the one item that would eventually prove critical to solving what he now realized was a homicide: the spent shell casing from a gun later identified as a .380 caliber Bersa pistol. Figuring out who the victim was did not take long. Whidbey Island was a small place where pretty much everyone knew each other. So when detectives examined the wallet inside the pocket of the dead man's pants, they recognized both his name and the Langley address printed on his driver's license. In the picture that stared back at them from the license, they recognized what was left of the driver's face. The murder victim was 32-year-old Russell Douglas. By 10 o'clock that night, the detectives were ready to clear the crime scene. Russell's body had been transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy, crime scene techs had photographed and collected evidence, and police who had been sent out to interview nearby residents had already come back with 2 helpful pieces of information that would give them a window for when the crime had occurred. According to the owner of a house just down Wall Road, a yellow SUV had entered and then quickly exited her driveway where her red Volvo was parked between 11:30 and noon the previous day. And the two local women who were out for a walk the previous afternoon told police that they had seen the yellow car at the end of the Black's driveway at about 4:30 p.m. So the police knew the murder probably occurred between 11:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. What police did not uncover was any information about other unfamiliar cars or people entering or leaving the area during that time period. But before the police could move ahead with their investigation, Detective Plumfield and his partner needed to inform the victim's wife, Brenna Douglas, that her husband was dead. So, at about 10:15 p.m. on December 27th, the two officers were standing at the front door of the Douglases' modest house on Furman Ave in the town of Langley. Even though the lights in the house were out, the door was opened almost immediately. Brenna, a big, strong woman with curly brown hair, was standing in front of them, dressed in her nightclothes. Without asking why they were there, Brenna exchanged a short greeting and then invited the men inside. When one of the detectives asked if they could all sit down to talk, Brenna led them to the dining room table. As Detective Plumberg pulled out a pad of paper so he could take some notes, Brenna settled herself into her chair on the other side of the table and looked out at them with a blank expression. In any murder case, the spouse is always one of the first people of interest. So instead of disclosing that Russell was dead, the detectives began by asking Brenna when she had last seen her husband. Over the next hour, even after police told Brenna that they had just discovered Russell's body in his yellow car and that he had been shot once in the forehead right between his eyes, Brenna displayed no sign of grief or even surprise. Instead, she shocked detectives by giving a list of grievances and complaints about her recently murdered husband. According to Brenna, she had initiated their recent separation by kicking Russell out of the house 7 months ago. She'd also filed a report with police alleging that he was verbally and physically abusive, that he threatened to punch her in the face, and had once, years ago, hit their son across his face. And even though Brenna had withdrawn that complaint, she insisted to investigators that the information she had given police at the time was true. Russell had been controlling, he had once called her fat, and he had cheated on her both with women and with men. Brenna also claimed that Russell had downloaded tons of pornography to his computer and that he liked using sex toys. As for their recent reconciliation, it had been his idea more than her idea for the two of them to try to get back together and fix their marriage. And even though they had had sex during their Christmas reunion, Brenna told detectives that she had only done that because she wanted to feel loved. Brenna also told police that Russell abused both alcohol and drugs, and if he had any friends at all, they were only the friends that she herself had made and introduced him to. Brenna's barrage of criticism about the father of her children and the man who was never late with child or spousal support and who showed up right away when Brenna needed help with a household project not only shocked the two detectives, it made them wonder if all that bitterness Brenna was expressing to them added up to a possible motive for Brenna to kill her husband. Sensing that the police had found her response surprising, Brenna wasted no time sketching out her own airtight alibi for December 26th, the day Russell was killed, from the moment he had kissed her and the children goodbye before leaving mid-morning to run some errands, right through the early afternoon of December 27th. As to why she had not contacted anyone when Russell did not come back to the house that afternoon or night, Brenna said she assumed he'd probably just blown her off again. But even as police verified Brenna's alibi, she remained a person of interest, especially when investigators found out that Russell had made Brenna the beneficiary of 2 life insurance policies. One of them was worth $200,000, and the other was worth close to $400,000. Those suspicions sharpened over the next couple of weeks when the interviews they conducted with Russell's family, his former lover Marge, and his co-workers at the land management company where he worked all painted a very different picture of Russell and suggested that maybe Brenna either had a distorted view of her husband, or she wasn't telling the truth, or that Russell was one of those people who turned into a totally different person when he was with his wife and kids. Because according to those other witnesses, Russell was a friendly, almost shy loner who had surprised his boss one day by wearing a kilt to work. But Russell came across in interviews as a smart and hardworking employee who took to heart his boss's request that Russell stick with more conventional wardrobe choices at work. Russell was definitely prone to depression, but his coworkers had never seen any sign that he was a drinker or that he even dabbled in drugs. Russell was excited about earning his master's in business administration. He obviously loved his kids. He talked a lot about the marital problems he and Brenna were having without ever bashing Brenna, but he also seemed very hopeful that they could save their marriage. And those close to both Russell and Brenna said the arguments between husband and wife were definitely two-sided, that Brenna had a short fuse and that her poor money management had led to her hair salon sinking into debt. If that was true, that Brenna was in serious debt, then Brenna would have a financial motive for getting rid of Russell and claiming the payout from his life insurance policies. Brenna had told detectives that she was not aware of Russell having any life insurance policies, but right after saying this to police, Brenna had contacted Russell's insurance companies and put in her claim as Russell's beneficiary. However, since Brenna was suspected in Russell's death, the insurance company would not allow her to collect any money. Instead, the insurance company sent investigators of their own out to speak with police about Brenna's possible involvement in Russell's death. And what Detective Plumberg found out in speaking with the insurance company's investigators was that Brenna had presented herself and Russell very differently to the insurance company than she had to police. To insurance investigators, she described Russell as a loving and supportive husband, and as a couple, they were committed to reconciliation after going through a minor rough patch in their marriage. At around the same time police were speaking with the insurance investigators, an examination of Russell's work computer and personal laptop were completed, and what police learned was that 1, Brenna had full access to her husband's email and bank accounts, and 2, Russell was not a big consumer of pornography like Brenna had said. After her initial interview with detectives on the night Russell's body was discovered, Brenna quickly hired a lawyer. She refused to take a lie detector test, and then she refused to answer any more questions unless the police could come up with hard evidence that would link Brenna to her husband's murder. And as suspicious as this made Brenna seem, the police didn't have any hard evidence connecting her to her husband's murder, and so for the time being, they had to leave her alone. However, that would change a few weeks later when police were able to examine Russell's phone records. And there was one number with an out-of-state area code that popped up a couple of times in the second half of December that did not fit the pattern of other calls to or from Russell's cell phone. And when Detective Plumberg called that number out in Las Vegas, Nevada, they found one of the things they'd been hoping for. Anyone who had a link to both the victim, Russell, and to their person of interest, his wife, Brenna. That person turned out to be none other than Peggy Sue Thomas, Brenna's best friend, who had moved off Whidbey Island back in 2000. That's when Peggy had gone to Las Vegas to compete in the Continental Mrs. USA pageant. Although Peggy Sue had won the evening gown competition and impressed judges with her stint in the Navy as an aircraft mechanic, she had not won the title. But during that competition, Peggy Sue had fallen in love with the bright lights and big city feels of Las Vegas. That's when she rented her house to Russell and Brenna and moved with her 2 daughters to Henderson, Nevada, just outside of Las Vegas, where Peggy now made a good living as a glamorous limousine driver with a loyal clientele of high rollers and big tippers. Peggy told detectives that she and her boyfriend had been out to Whidbey Island over the Christmas holiday, and that she, Peggy, had seen Russell at his apartment just outside of Seattle on December 23rd. But she had only seen him long enough to hand him a Christmas gift that was for his wife, Brenna. That's what the 3 phone calls that the police had seen in the phone records were about. Peggy had called Russell to arrange big tippers. Peggy told detectives that she and her boyfriend had been out to Whidbey Island over the Christmas holiday, and that she, Peggy, had seen Russell at his apartment just outside of Seattle on December 23rd. But she had only seen him long enough to hand him a Christmas gift that was for his wife, Brenna. That's what the 3 phone calls that the police had seen in the phone records were about. Peggy had called Russell to arrange this gift exchange, but when he didn't answer that call, the 2 of them had kind of played phone tag for a little bit before they did connect and make their plans. As for Peggy Sue's boyfriend, Jim Hewden, he was also a native of Whidbey Island, but he'd left the island years ago after he had struck it rich selling a computer program he had designed to the computer giant Microsoft. And although Peggy Sue and Jim had spent Christmas together in Washington state, Jim had not come with her to see Russell on the night of the 23rd to deliver the package for Brenna. Peggy Sue admitted that most of what she knew about Russell was secondhand information she had gotten from his wife and her best friend, Brenna, and almost all of it was very negative about how terrible Russell was. However, Peggy Sue would tell police that during her brief visit with Russell on the 23rd, he was very nice and seemed happy and excited about spending Christmas with Brenna and the kids. By the time the call ended with Peggy Sue, Detective Plumberg had started to wonder if Russell's murder would ever be solved, because every lead they followed up on seemed to turn into a dead end. By June 2004, 5 months after Russell's murder, and with no fresh or promising leads, Detective Plumberg decided to go back and review the entire investigation. But it wouldn't be until the end of July, a full 7 months after Russell had been shot at point-blank range, that police would get the first of a string of tips that would eventually break the murder case wide open. And the first of those tips would come so far out of left field that at first, Detective Plumberg literally could not believe what he was hearing. On July 26th, the Island County Sheriff's Office picked up a call from a man who asked them if they had any information on an unsolved homicide that had happened around Christmas the year before, in 2003. When the detective who had answered the call replied that they did have such a case, the caller went quiet. After a few long seconds, the man told the investigator that he had information, but he was, quote, scared to talk about it. Over the next several days, this caller, who initially refused to give police his name or his location, would eventually give Island County detectives his own name, Bill Hill, and the name of a person who Bill said had first-hand knowledge of who killed Russell Douglas. After chasing down so many false leads and dead ends in this murder investigation, Detective Plumberg was very skeptical of this story. But as more and more details showed that Bill wasn't just getting his information from news stories, the detective got more and more interested. And by August 4th, 2004, just a week after Bill had made his first call to the Island County Sheriff's Office, Detective Plumberg and his commander were on a plane headed to Florida to talk with Bill's mysterious person of interest. At the same time, 2 other detectives were on a plane headed to Las Vegas to have another chat with Brenna's best friend, Peggy Sue Thomas. Once Detective Plumberg and his commander arrived in the small town of Punta Gorda on the southwest coast of Florida, they wasted no time following up on the tip they had received from Bill. Not only were they very eager to talk to this mystery witness, they were also eager to get back out of Florida before the big storm system that was forming out over the Caribbean Ocean just off the coast of Central America turned into a hurricane. But just a few hours after knocking on the door of this new person of interest, Detective Plumberg was once again feeling defeated and more confused than ever. Their mystery witness had been more than willing to talk with the detectives and had even gone with them to the local Punta Gorda police station for questioning. But they denied knowing anything about what happened to Russell and were flabbergasted when they were asked if they were involved in the murder. Their response to that question was, "Why would I do that? What possible motive could I have?" And in truth, Detective Plumberg was secretly thinking the same thing. It didn't make any sense. Plus, he knew that police had no hard evidence at all that could link anyone, including this new mystery person in Florida, to Russell's murder. An hour later, the interview was over, and Detective Plumberg's mystery witness had left the police station and returned home. The only good news for the Washington Island County detectives was that they'd still managed to fly out of Florida ahead of the storm. And they were lucky because by August 9th, just a few days after they had left, that storm had turned into a Category 4 hurricane that headed straight into Florida's southwestern coast and the town of Punta Gorda, where they had been. Meanwhile, the team of Island County detectives who had headed to Las Vegas had hit a similar dead end. In his conversation with Island County investigators, the caller, Bill Hill, had mentioned the name of a woman named Peggy, as well as the name of another woman, Brenna. Bill had told police that he'd heard both names mentioned in connection with Russell's murder. With Brenna no longer talking to investigators, Detective Plumberg had wanted his officers to speak again to Peggy Sue, and this time in person and on the record. But Peggy Sue said she had no information for County Island officers. She was also outraged at the sight of detectives showing up with a search warrant at her house in Henderson, Nevada. Peggy Sue watched as police searched everywhere in her house for any evidence that she had lied to police when she described her meeting with Russell on December 23rd at his apartment. And after the police could find no evidence, the very frustrated investigators began asking Peggy Sue about her boyfriend, Jim Huden, and his possible connection to Brenna or Russell Douglas. But it would turn out that not only had Jim never met Russell, Jim had left Peggy Sue in early February of 2003, 2 months after Russell's murder, and the couple had not parted on friendly terms. Jim had been married when Peggy Sue had met him on Whidbey Island in 2002, and even though he'd lived with Peggy in Las Vegas for several months, ultimately he decided to return to his wife and his small computer software business. That said, Peggy Sue could still account for their movements on the day Russell was killed, December 26, 2003. And she even managed to locate some old receipts from that day to show detectives exactly where they had gone on Whidbey Island before leaving Washington State late that night to return to Nevada. When detectives pressed Peggy Sue on having a financial motive for killing Russell, maybe she was going to split his life insurance policy with her good friend Brenna, Peggy pointed out that she already made a very comfortable living, so why would she do that? So, a few days later, Island County detectives came back from Nevada as empty-handed as Detective Plumberg had been when he came back from Florida. But 15 days later, on August 18, 2004, all of that would change. That was the day that the local Whidbey newspaper ran a news story based on unofficial sources that mentioned that former Whidbey Island residents Jim Huden and Peggy Sue Thomas were persons of interest in the ongoing investigation into Russell Douglas's murder. And on August 19th, 1 day later, yet another person who said they knew something about the case stepped forward. This time, it was a former police officer named Keith Ogden who lived in New Mexico. Keith, who had heard about the news story from a cousin who lived on Whidbey Island, would tell Island County investigators a story that put everything they had heard on their recent trips to Florida and Nevada in a whole new light. Because not only did Keith have the name of the likely murderer, he also had the weapon that was likely used to kill Russell Douglas. It was the .380 Bersa pistol, and ballistic tests would soon confirm that the markings on the shell casing found at the crime scene and the bullet that had been removed from the inside of Russell's skull exactly matched the grooves on the inside of that gun. The murder weapon, combined with the stories police now had from both Keith and their other informant, Bill Hill, finally allowed Detective Plumberg and his team of investigators to identify Russell's killer. Based on that information, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Russell Douglas on December 26, 2003. On that morning, Russell took special pleasure in the time he was spending with his family. Their Christmas celebration the day before had been everything he could have wished for. After arriving in Langley on Christmas Eve, Brenna had taken his car to the store and bought pies and other fixings for the Christmas dinner they planned to share the next day with Brenna's widowed stepfather. And except for Russell's gift of lingerie to Brenna, the other gifts he had brought for his family, especially the new Xbox video game console he'd bought for Jack, turned out to be nothing short of inspired. After Brenna's stepfather left at 5 or 6 p.m., Russell and Jack played Xbox while Brenna and Hannah watched a movie together. Once the kids were in bed, Russell was allowed into Brenna's room where they watched a movie together in bed and then fell asleep. And then on that morning, the 26th, he and Brenna made love. Now, having eaten breakfast with the kids, Russell was getting ready to go out and run a few errands. In fact, he had arranged a surprise for Brenna, one that he knew would make her happy. So, at about 10:45 or 11 a.m., Russell gave Jack, Hannah, and Brenna each a kiss and a hug before leaving the house and climbing into the driver's seat of his yellow Chevy Tracker. Whether anyone inside the house saw him or not, it felt good to wave at the house where his family lived before he pulled out onto Furman Ave and headed west toward Freeland. Russell's killer had chosen the time of their rendezvous very carefully. They had given Russell clear directions, and they also knew that Russell was very punctual, and if anything, he might arrive a little early. But the killer was in place and ready well before Russell arrived. The killer had only test-fired the Bersa pistol a few times, but at close range, they figured it would be nearly impossible to miss. Right on time, the killer heard the sound of an approaching car, and so before Russell pulled into the driveway, the killer stepped back into the shadows and waited. A moment later, Russell pulled his yellow Chevy Tracker into the long driveway that led to 6665 Wall Road. Now that he saw how out of the way this place was, he wondered why on earth they hadn't agreed to meet somewhere closer to Langley. Still, Russell had enjoyed the drive, and except for his wrong turn into that driveway up the road, he hadn't really had any trouble finding their meeting spot. Anyway, it would make a good story to tell Brenna, since she was the reason he was here in the first place. Almost as soon as Russell had pulled into that parking spot and turned off the car engine, he saw a figure in front of him step out of the woodline. With the sunglasses still on, it was hard to make out this person's face, but Russell figured it had to be the woman he was here to meet. How many other women were 6 feet tall on Whidbey Island? But before Russell could unbuckle his seatbelt and step out of the car to greet Peggy Sue, this person from the tree line had rushed over to his vehicle and stopped right outside of his car door, kind of blocking him from getting out. And so as they did that, Russell turned and looked at them and realized very quickly this person was not Peggy Sue. He didn't know who this person was. Instinctively, Russell just started to roll down his window to ask this person what they wanted. But as he was rolling the window down, Russell suddenly froze, because this stranger was now holding a pistol. And without ever saying a word, the stranger raised the pistol, aimed it at Russell's face, and pulled the trigger. As the bullet traveled through Russell's brain, his brain tissue stretched along the trajectory of the bullet, and when the tissue did tear, it snapped back into place with force so great that Russell's forehead suddenly bulged outward, and along with blood, the gray matter of Russell's brain began leaking in ropey strands out of the small hole centered right between his eyes. Before leaving, the killer opened the driver's side door of the Tracker. They wanted to make sure Russell really was snapped back into place with force so great that Russell's forehead suddenly bulged outward, and along with blood, the gray matter of Russell's brain began leaking in ropey strands out of the small hole centered right between his eyes. Before leaving, the killer opened the driver's side door of the Tracker. They wanted to make sure Russell really was dead. By the time the police discovered Russell's body one day later, his body was stiff and cold to the touch. Even before the EMTs confirmed the cause of death, Detective Plumberg would describe the wound as a massive head trauma caused by an execution-style shooting that occurred from a distance of just 12 inches. It would turn out Russell's killer was Peggy Sue's boyfriend, Jim Huden. And it was Peggy Sue who had arranged the time and place where Russell would be murdered. Peggy Sue had in fact called Russell several times not long before Christmas to arrange a meeting so Peggy Sue could give Russell a Christmas present from her to Brenna. But Peggy Sue never then went to Russell's apartment in Renton on December 23rd to drop that present off. Instead, Peggy had told Russell on the subsequent phone calls to meet her on December 26th at 6665 Wall Road, and at this meeting she would give him her present for Brenna. Peggy had chosen this location because it was already a very isolated spot, and the family who lived at 6665 Wall Road, the Black family, they'd be gone in Costa Rica, so there'd be no witnesses. And so on December 26th, when Russell arrived at the meeting spot, instead of Peggy Sue coming up to him, it was her boyfriend, Jim Huden, who would step out of the tree line, walk over to Russell's car, and then shoot Russell point blank in the face. It would turn out that during the 4 months that Jim and Peggy Sue had lived together in Las Vegas back in 2003, Peggy had spent a lot of time on the phone listening to Russell's wife, Brenna, complain about Russell. None of what Brenna had to say was new, but now Peggy Sue could share her friend's complaints with her new boyfriend, Jim. When Jim later confessed his crime to his good friend, Bill Hill, down in Florida, where Jim lived with his wife, Jean, Jim told his friend that he decided to kill Russell because Peggy had told him Russell was abusive to his wife and children. Jim said that he himself had had a violent stepfather, and killing Russell seemed both thrilling and like a kind of revenge killing for what Jim himself claimed to have suffered. Island County detectives in Washington had a different theory. They believed that Brenna may have offered to split the proceeds from Russell's life insurance if Peggy and Jim killed Russell. At that point in Peggy Sue's life, and Jim's life too, money had become a big problem. 7 months after hearing Jim's confession, Bill Hill's conscience finally got to him, and he contacted investigators in Whidbey and told them what he knew. But even though detectives then flew to Florida to question Jim, who was the so-called mystery witness, and Nevada to question Peggy Sue, it wasn't until Keith Ogden contacted police on August 18th and provided the murder weapon that police would have the physical evidence they needed to arrest Jim for murder. According to Keith, who had met Jim and Peggy in Nevada, Jim had approached Keith and asked him to hold on to a gun for him since Jim said he didn't want to keep it in a house with Peggy's kids. Keith agreed, but when Keith heard that Jim was a suspect in a homicide, he realized the gun Jim had given him could potentially be a murder weapon, and so that's why he had come forward. 4 months later, in December of 2004, almost a year to the day that Russell was killed, Detective Plumberg requested an arrest warrant be issued for Jim Huden. But it would take another 7 years before either Jim or Peggy Sue were actually arrested and charged for the murder of Russell Douglas. Shortly after being interviewed by investigators down in Florida in August of 2004, Jim, the mystery witness, had taken advantage of the chaos caused by Hurricane Charlie to flee over the border from the U.S. into Mexico. It wasn't until Jim's wife, Jean, who got tired of sending money to her husband in Mexico, came forward that the police were finally able to track Jim down. And so on June 9th, 2011, Jim was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. While Jim had been on the run, Peggy Sue had gone on to marry and then divorce Alaskan oil millionaire Mark Allen. After 7 months of marriage to him, she had walked away with more than $1 million in money and assets. At the time of her arrest, 1 month after Jim's, on July 9th, 2011, Peggy Sue was living off the shore of New Mexico on a houseboat she had named Off the Hook. While Jim refused to implicate Peggy Sue in Russell's murder, Peggy Sue didn't waste a minute before she put the full blame for Russell's murder squarely on Jim's shoulders. 1 year after their arrests, on July 20th, 2012, 59-year-old Jim Huden was convicted of first-degree murder in the shooting death of Russell Douglas and sentenced to 80 years in prison at the Washington State Penitentiary. 6 months later, on January 26, 2013, 3 days before her murder trial was scheduled to begin, 47-year-old Peggy Sue Thomas Allen pled guilty to a lesser charge of first-degree criminal assistance involving first-degree murder. Peggy Sue was given the maximum sentence of 4 years in prison at Washington Corrections Center for Women. The presiding judge said he regretted the Washington state statute that limited him to imposing what he called a shockingly short sentence. Peggy Sue was released in 2016. Russell's wife, Brenna, who now goes by her maiden name, Brenna Haslam, has never faced any formal charges in her husband's murder, although Island County investigators have continued to treat her as a person of interest. In December of 2005, so 2 years after Russell's death, his insurance company agreed to release a payout of $400,000 from his life insurance policy to Brenna. Brenna used the money to buy a new car and a new house that she subsequently lost 1 year later when she stopped paying the mortgage. There is no hard evidence that Russell Douglas ever physically abused his wife or his children. Just before 11 p.m. at night on May 20th, 1967, a 50-year-old man named Stephen McCulloch staggered into the Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg, Canada. Stephen was so physically weak that his oldest son, Mark, was there with him, physically holding him up, carrying him into the hospital. When the nurses at the front desk saw the pair walk in, they immediately got up and walked around their desk over to these two guys and said, "Hey, what's going on? What's wrong with him?" And so Stephen, at this point, is so uncomfortable he can barely talk, but he takes a deep breath and then he tells the nurses that earlier that day he had been burned on his chest and stomach, and now he had this blinding headache and he was so nauseous and he could barely walk. The nurses knew clearly this is an emergency, and so they quickly ushered the pair down the hall to an exam room, and then a couple of minutes later, doctors came into the room and they asked Stefan to show them his burns. Stefan, who was already lying on his back on the exam table, slowly reaches down and grabs the bottom of his shirt, and he lifts it up, and the doctors are stunned at what they see on his stomach. There was a very strange burn pattern that none of them had seen before. And so the doctors, they move in to get a better look at his injury, and as they're staring at it, they ask Stefan to explain how he got this burn. Now, what the doctors didn't realize is that Stefan was very conflicted. He knew if he told the truth about how he got this burn, then he would open himself and his family up to ridicule and skepticism. But as he's laying there and the doctors are waiting for his answer, he finally decides that the right thing to do here is just tell the truth. And so he takes a deep breath and then tells the doctors what happened to him. And by the time he was finished telling this story of what happened to his stomach, the doctors had stopped looking at his injury and instead were just standing in the middle of the room staring at Stefan with eyes wide and their mouths open. They were all literally speechless. Within 24 hours, Stefan's story had made news all over the world, and his story had attracted the attention of numerous US and Canadian secretive government agencies who were keen to interview Stefan one-on-one to really find out what he knew. In short, what Stefan claimed happened to him, dubbed the Falcon Lake incident, was a very big deal. However, the farther this story went and the more people that heard it, the more people started to question the validity of this story. It just seemed too unbelievable that maybe Stefan is just lying or this is a hoax. And so before I tell you Stefan's actual account of what happened at Falcon Lake, I'm going to give you a little context about who Stefan was prior to the incident. Because ultimately, Stefan's credibility in your eyes will determine if you really believe what happened to him. Stefan was born in the early 20th century in Poland, and when World War II broke out, he was captured by the Nazis and put into one of their concentration camps. It was called the Gross Rosen camp, and it was located in Poland. During his time at that camp, Stefan would bear witness to the Nazis perpetrating some of the worst atrocities ever committed against humanity. In total, approximately 125,000 people were held prisoner at the Gross Rosen camp, including Stefan. And of those 125,000, 40,000 of them would be killed primarily on site at the camp or on a Nazi-led death march. After the camp was finally liberated in early 1945, Stefan worked as a translator for the US Army, helping them continue to liberate other concentration camps across Europe. But by 1946, Stefan was ready to leave Europe and start a new life somewhere else and put World War II behind him. And so he and his wife, who also was held in a concentration camp during World War II, fled Poland with their 3 young kids and resettled in Winnipeg, Canada. And for the next 20 years, the McCullochs lived a very peaceful life. Stefan would find work as a mechanic at a cement factory, and his wife and his kids would make many friends and fall in love with the Winnipeg community. However, the McCullochs' life would take a sudden turn for the worst on May 20th, 1967. That was the day of the Falcon Lake incident. Stefan was a very passionate amateur prospector. A prospector is someone who searches the earth for mineral deposits, usually gold or silver. Stefan would spend much of his off time traveling all over Canada to different wilderness areas to basically hike around the forests and up over the mountains, stopping to hack into the earth with his pickaxe in hope of discovering treasures underneath the surface. Now, Stefan almost never found any treasures on any of his prospecting journeys, but he wasn't really in prospecting for the riches. Stefan just loved being outdoors and being in nature. It was very calming and peaceful for him, and considering how traumatic his earlier life had been, being in the concentration camp during World War II, finding moments of peace in his life was very important to him. And so, in May of 1967, Stefan decided to go out on another one of his prospecting trips, this time to an area called Falcon Lake. Falcon Lake is a fairly large lake located about 100 miles to the east of Winnipeg. And surrounding this lake was a big forest that Stefan had heard contained silver deposits tucked away in the hillsides. And so on Friday, May 19th, Stefan was ready to go on this trip. And so he packed up all of his prospecting equipment. He said goodbye to his wife and his kids. And then he left the house and made his way to the bus stop where he hopped on a Greyhound bus. 2 hours later, he got off the bus at the stop closest to Falcon Lake, and from there, he made his way to this cheap motel that was right on the side of the highway. He got a room, he got a quick bite to eat in their cafe, and then returned to his room and went to bed. The next morning, May 20th, 1967, so the day of the Falcon Lake incident, Stefan woke up early, right around 5 a.m. And by 5:30 a.m., he had all of his equipment either in his backpack or on his belt, and he was making his way out of the motel's front doors. Right outside of this motel was the highway that ran left to right, and 7, so the day of the Falcon Lake incident, Stefan woke up early, right around 5 a.m. And by 5:30 a.m., he had all of his equipment either in his backpack or on his belt, and he was making his way out of the motel's front doors. Right outside of this motel was the highway that ran left to right, and on the other side of that highway was this huge forest that Falcon Lake was deep inside of. And so after Stefan left the motel, he crossed over that highway and began walking into the woods. And for the next several hours, Stefan just kind of meandered his way through the woods. He wasn't on a trail. He was just using his compass to make sure he was generally walking in the direction of Falcon Lake. At around 9 a.m., so he's been hiking now for several hours, he looked up ahead and he saw there was a clearing on the side of this hill. And so Stefan walked into this clearing and two things became immediately apparent. One, he was right near Falcon Lake. From his perspective on this clearing, he could look down just a couple of hundred feet and there was the lake. And two, the reason this clearing existed and why no trees were growing on it at all is because under his feet was just a huge rock face, like a quartz vein that was running across this hillside. And so this was like the perfect place for Stefan to begin prospecting. And so he set his things down, he got out his pickaxe, he got his welding gloves on, he put on his welding goggles as well. They protected his eyes from any rocks that were flying as he was hacking into the ground. And then he got to work. For the next couple of hours, Stefan very diligently hacked away at this big rock, but he didn't find any silver or anything else of note. And so, around 11 a.m., Stefan was hungry and tired, and so he put his pickaxe down, he took his goggles off, he took his gloves off, and he sat down on this rock facing the lake to have some lunch. And as he sat there enjoying his food, all he could hear in the distance were the sound of a few geese down on the lake making some noise, but other than that, it was totally quiet. After he was done eating, he put his gear back on and got back to work. About an hour later, at around 12:15 p.m., Stefan was still hacking away at the rock when, despite all the noise he was making as he smashed the ground with his pickaxe, he could hear a really loud commotion coming from behind him. And it turned out when he stopped the pickaxe, the commotion sounded like geese honking and going wild. And so he dropped his pickaxe, he took his goggles, put them up on his forehead, and then he stood up and he turned around and he looked down towards the lake where he heard all these geese going crazy. And the first thing he noticed was there were some geese on the lake that appeared to be flying off in different directions like they had been startled. But what really immediately caught his attention was not the geese, but what had very likely startled the geese. And that was two bright, glowing red objects that were flying slowly across the lake towards him, kind of roughly over where the geese were. And now these objects, they were cylindrical. They appeared to be about maybe 30 or 40 feet wide. They didn't have any sort of emission coming off of them. They weren't making any noise. They were just kind of slowly making their way over towards where Stefan was. Now, as Stefan is watching this happen, he wasn't fearful. He assumed those have to be military aircraft. As it was, this part of Canada, Falcon Lake, is very remote. There's not many people around. And so, logically, it made sense that perhaps there's a military that's doing training exercises in this area. And so feeling much more intrigued than fearful, Stefan just continued to watch as these red aircraft got closer and closer to his side of the lake. And then when these two craft were about 200 feet away from where Stefan was standing, they came to a stop and they were just hovering in the air. And then one of the craft suddenly turned orange and began going up into the clouds, and then at some point just vanished. And then the other craft, instead of going up, just continued descending very slowly, now very clearly towards this open rock face that Stefan was standing on. Now, again, Stefan was totally convinced that these were military aircraft, conducting some sort of exercise. And so he's not fearful. He is just intrigued by what he's seeing. And in fact, by this point, he had convinced himself that this second aircraft that was now coming down to land on these rocks must have experienced some sort of issue, and they were landing in order to fix it. And Stefan even thought to himself, well, hey, I'm a mechanic. Maybe I can help the pilot or pilots with whatever's going on with their craft. Once the craft finally did touch down on the rocks about 150 feet away from Stefan, it changed colors from red to stainless steel with an orange glow around the outside of the aircraft. And inside of this craft, a really bright purple light came on that Stefan was only aware of because there was a couple of small holes on the outside of this craft where this purple light was coming through. But these little rays of purple light coming out of this craft were so bright that it actually was hard for Stefan to look directly at the craft. And so his welding goggles were still on his forehead, so he pulled them down, put them over his eyes, and his welding goggles had a kind of tint to them, so it was like he was looking through sunglasses. And with those on, he was able to continue looking at the craft. And so through his goggles, Stefan is still just standing in the same spot where he first saw these craft, and he's watching this craft that's now landed 150 feet away from him, and he's fully expecting any minute for the pilot or pilots to come out of the craft and explain what's going on. But at first, nothing happens. And so Stefan is just standing there waiting for something to happen when he realizes he has his sketchbook in his pocket. Stefan liked to bring his sketchbook along on his prospecting trips because he liked to sketch things. And so he figured while he waited for the pilot or pilots to emerge, he would sketch the craft. And so for the next couple of minutes, that's what he did. And then after he was done sketching it, he put his sketchbook away, and then really nothing happened for about another 30 minutes. He just stood there and the craft remained motionless. But after about 30 minutes of the craft having landed, it opened. There was like a sliding door on the side of the craft facing Stefan, and it revealed the beautiful, bright purple interior of this craft. But from Stefan's perspective, because of how bright the lights were and how far away he was, he couldn't tell what was inside of the craft. But Stefan's thinking, okay, clearly now the pilot or pilots are coming outside. And so Stefan felt really relieved, and he was just standing there waiting to talk to whoever was inside. But again, nothing happened. And so now, feeling just plain curious, Stefan decided, you know what, I'm going to walk over there and I'm going to yell into this open door to the pilot or pilots inside and make sure they're okay. And so he starts slowly making his way across the rock face towards this craft and this open door. And when he gets about 60 feet away from the craft, he suddenly stops because now he can hear from inside of this craft the sound of two voices talking to each other. He can't really tell what they're saying, but very clearly there is communication happening inside of this craft. And so Stefan assumed that must be the pilots, and so he called out to them in English. And the second Stefan yelled out to this craft, the voices immediately came to a stop, and they did not respond to Stefan. And so Stefan is calling out to them in English, hey, are you okay? What are you doing in there? And when English didn't work, Stefan called out in Russian. He called out in German, Italian, French, Ukrainian. And when all of those didn't work, he went back to English and just continued kind of calling out, trying to get them to please come out and talk to him. But he got no response and no one came out of the craft. And so at this point, Stefan thought, okay, I'm totally committed, so I need to keep going and make sure the pilot or pilots are okay. And so he continued walking closer and closer to this open door of the craft. And when he got about 10 feet away, he was suddenly struck by the incredible craftsmanship of this craft. He couldn't see any rivets anywhere on this amazing piece of machinery. meaning this craft appeared like it had somehow been carved out of one enormous piece of steel, which seemed totally impossible. Also, Stefan noticed there were no insignia on the outside of this craft. There was no flag or anything kind of denoting who was flying it. There was really nothing on the outside of the craft. But Stefan just kept on going until he was standing right outside of this open door. He's only a couple feet away from it, and now he's looking directly inside, and he doesn't see the pilot or pilots. And in fact, because of how bright this purple light is coming out, even with his goggles, it's really hard to see what's inside of this craft. But he can clearly see inside there is some sort of panel in the back of the craft with lots of flashing lights, almost like a computer, and there were other kind of columns of light moving around inside the craft at different angles. But after looking in this craft for only a few seconds, the door suddenly slid shut. And then Stefan, without really thinking about it, reached out and touched the craft. And the second he did that, two things happened. One, the door suddenly slid shut. And then Stefan, without really thinking about it, reached out and touched the craft. And the second he did that, two things happened. One, the hand that he touched the craft with, he was wearing a big welding glove, and the second he made contact with that craft, the leather glove began to melt. Not even catch on fire, it just instantly began to melt. And so he began frantically ripping the glove off to get it off of him to avoid injury. And then the second thing that happened is the craft began rotating counterclockwise until this vent that was on the outside of the craft, one of the very few things that was on the outside of the craft that actually Stefan had noted in his sketch. He had drawn this grate that sat on the outside of the craft. This grate rotated around until it was aimed directly at Stefan. Now, to picture this grate, picture like a vent you would see inside of a building where air conditioning blows air out of, right? It's kind of like that same size, the size of a license plate on a car. And instead of there being vertical slats along the vent, like you would see with an air conditioning vent cover, on this vent, on this craft, it was like a checkerboard pattern with little buttonholes all over this vent. And so Stefan is looking at this vent, and then suddenly something shoots through the vent, like an explosion that hits him square in the chest and lights him on fire. His shirt is literally in flames, and so Stefan is frantically trying to rip off his shirt. He throws it on the ground, he's stomping the flame, and as he's doing that, he looks up and sees this craft has somehow immediately shot into the sky and is now disappearing into the clouds. Now, Stefan had no idea what just happened. All he knew is his chest and his stomach now hurt tremendously. But before he could deal with that, he developed this unbelievable headache. He suddenly felt so nauseous, and he felt delirious, like he was drunk. Trying not to panic, Stefan, who now is shirtless and badly burned, he ran over and grabbed some of his things, and then he began heading back into the woods to make his way back towards the motel. It would take him several hours of stumbling through the forest, stopping periodically to vomit, but he would eventually reach the highway, he would cross over, and he would make his way into the motel right around 4 p.m. And when he got there, he made his way into the cafe, and he asked the staff if they knew where the nearest doctor was. These staff members would later tell investigators that when Stefan came tumbling into the cafe without his shirt on, looking totally horrible, they assumed he was drunk. But after talking to him, he didn't smell at all like alcohol. Instead, he reeked of this horrible sulfur smell. The staff would tell Stefan that the nearest doctor was 45 miles away. And so at this point, Stefan decided his best bet was actually to just get on a bus and go back to Winnipeg, where his family could take him to the nearest hospital. And so somehow, Stefan managed to make his way to the bus stop. He hopped on a Greyhound bus, he went to Winnipeg, and then his oldest son, Mark, met him at the bus stop and practically carried him into the hospital. The very strange checkerboard burn pattern found on Stefan's abdomen, where he claims this craft turned its vent and fired on him, were determined not to be thermal burns, meaning he didn't get them from something hot touching his skin, like everyone initially suspected. Instead, they were determined to be chemical burns, but literally no one, doctors, scientists, government agencies, no one could figure out what chemical actually burned his skin. In fact, no one was ever able to actually identify what was causing all of these ailments that Stefan was complaining of, from the headache to the nausea to the weakness to these burns, and he was tested for basically everything, from radiation poisoning to very common ailments and illnesses, and everything came back negative. Experts would go out to Falcon Lake, to the area that Stefan described seeing this craft, and sure enough, they would find an open rock face, and right around the area that Stefan described was this circular burn pattern, as if something had been perched right there that shot some sort of exhaust into the ground, and the area around this landing site was determined to be highly radioactive. Although it is assumed that the reason that area is radioactive is because there is a vein of radium that runs underneath the rocks near the area. However, what no one could explain away were the 3 identical pieces of what looked like metal, which actually turned out to be a very rare type of silver, that were located near this burn circle. Now, even though the Falcon Lake area was known apparently for having silver deposits up in the hillsides, this silver, these 3 pieces of silver, were not from the hillsides of Falcon Lake. This silver was heavily manufactured. Someone, something, some machine had manipulated the metal to bend and be cut in a very particular way. And all 3 of these pieces of very rare silver were highly radioactive. They would also find traces of this very rare type of silver that seemed to have seeped into some of the loose rocks that were inside of that burned out circle, almost like the silver had melted into the rock. But despite these pieces of evidence that do seem to suggest that Stefan really did see some craft land on these rocks, and despite the fact that the US government and the Canadian government both thoroughly investigated this case and they were not able to debunk it, they basically said, well, something happened, but we don't know what. Despite all of that, Stefan and his family's lives were forever upended after this incident. Stefan was ridiculed and accused of lying and of being crazy, and his kids were unfortunately bullied at school. Shortly before Stefan died in 1999 at the age of 83, he was asked if he regretted coming forward with this story. And he would say, yes, I wish I never told anyone. But he would also say, at the time, he really felt like he had a duty to tell the world about what happened. Stefan never changed his story, and he never came out and said, I think this craft came from another world, another planet, another universe. He just said, look, I think it was an experimental aircraft. That's it. He also never made a dime on this experience. If anything, he lost money because he paid to write a 40-page pamphlet that explained what happened to him, and then he left all these copies on his porch. So if news people showed up or if nosy neighbors showed up and had questions, he would just point to the stack of the books and say, take one and read it.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are not available on this podcast. They're only on YouTube. Again, the channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.